Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. Okay, so something totally messed up happened to me and my family a few months back, and honestly, I still get chills thinking about it. We were at Salt Lick State Park, right? Beautiful place, especially in the fall. All those leaves turning colors, crisp air. My brother Ricardo, his son Lucas, my son Mika and me, we planned a day hike on the Hasik Cave Trail. We love being outdoors, and the caves sounded cool. The hike itself was awesome, no joke. The woods were quiet, and the caves were seriously impressive, damp and dark and a little creepy even with our headlamps on. We spent the whole afternoon exploring, laughing, just having a good time, you know. Totally normal day. It wasn't until we got back to the parking lot that things started to go sideways. Ricardo reaches for his keys to open his car, and they're just gone, vanished. We all looked at each other, confused, like, where could they possibly be? We retraced our steps, checked our backpacks, emptied our pockets. Nothing. The sun was already starting to go down, casting these long shadows across the parking lot. Made everything feel different, you know? Like that peaceful daytime woods feeling was already fading. Then we realized, crap, Ricardo's car keys had the only car fob, so no alarms to set off, nothing. And to make it even worse, his phone was dead. And the only flashlight we had was locked inside his car, because of course it was. We checked our phones. Signal bars completely empty. Zero reception. Salt Lick is pretty remote, turns out, like way more remote than I usually go for. Panic started to prickle at the edges of my calm. We kept searching, like we were going to magically conjure the keys from thin air. We tore apart the car, checked under the seats, in the glove compartment, everywhere we could think of, even though we knew we hadn't even opened the car yet. It was getting darker and darker, the shadows stretching out like fingers from the trees. That happy, sunny afternoon feeling was long gone, replaced by this creeping sense of unease. The kind where your skin starts to crawl for no real reason. Just when we were about to completely lose it, headlights appear down the main park road. Thank God, right? Hope flared up. It's got to be someone who can help. And sure enough, it's a park ranger truck, slow rolling into the parking lot. Driven by this woman ranger, who honestly looked about as thrilled to be there as we were to be stuck. I rushed over to her truck, explained the whole lost keys nightmare, how we were stranded with no cell service. She listened, her eyes darting around the woods, not really meeting my gaze. She was young, maybe early 20s, and seemed jumpy, relieved maybe that we were there. She agreed to give us a ride to the park office, said they usually had a landline or something there, and reception, supposedly. As we piled into the back of her truck, me, Mika, Ricardo, and Lucas squeezed together, she sighs and says, almost like she's talking to herself, "I hate this place." We all kind of look at each other. Hate it? It's beautiful, we thought. But then she explains, too much weird stuff happens out here. And that's when the hairs on the back of my neck stood up a little. Weird stuff? I asked, trying to keep my voice light, like I was just curious. She glances in the rearview mirror, then quickly looks back at the road ahead. Yeah, she says, low and kind of hesitant. People see things, hear things, Sasquatch stories mostly, and other stuff. She shivered a little, even though it wasn't that cold yet. Sasquatch. Okay, yeah, that's woods weird, but still probably just stories, right? Then she adds, almost like she can't stop herself from telling us, I've seen stuff myself on patrol at night. Shapes at the edge of the tree line, things moving fast. Now this ranger lady, she's not some crackpot, you could tell. She was genuinely nervous. And her being nervous started making me nervous. The woods suddenly seemed darker, closer, like they were pressing in on us. She made 2 trips, hauling us all to the park office in her truck. It was this small, closed-up building, kind of isolated on its own little patch of clearing a few miles from the trailhead. She promised she'd come back later to check on us and maybe try to help with the keys somehow, but you could tell she wasn't thrilled about the idea of coming back out to the trail parking lot alone in the dark. She practically peeled out of there after dropping us off, kicking up gravel. So, there we were, stranded again, just in a different, slightly less creepy spot. At first, it felt like an upgrade. At least we weren't completely alone in the woods anymore. But the park office was closed, locked up tight. And still no cell service, not even a bar. What the hell? There was a payphone bolted to the side of the building, one of those old school ones. Hallelujah, maybe this would work. I dug in my purse for change, fished out a bunch of quarters, dialed my husband Jean's number. Please, please pick up. It rang and rang and rang. Voicemail. Damn it. Okay, breathe, Jana. He might be busy. I tried again. Voicemail again. Okay, this is starting to get really unnerving. We decided to wait outside. There was a picnic table next to the office, under this single streetlight. The night sky was actually pretty incredible, clear, full of stars. Normally I'd be loving that. But right now it just felt vast and empty, and somehow not comforting at all, but threatening. Like all that space was just waiting to be filled with something unknown. We sat there for a while trying to make small talk, but it was forced. Lucas and Mika were getting antsy, starting to bicker a little. Ricardo was pacing, still clearly stressed about the keys. And I was just staring out at the tree line, feeling that weird prickling on my skin again, that sense of being watched. It was ridiculous, I knew it was, just the woods at night getting to my imagination. And then the streetlight flickered, once, twice, then just died, went black. We were plunged into almost complete darkness, just the faintest light filtering from the distant highway, barely enough to see your hand in front of your face. Okay, that was not good. That was really not good. My heart started hammering in my chest. This wasn't just a spooky story from the ranger anymore. This was something else. And then we heard it. A sound. Heavy. Moving in the shadows. At first, I thought it was just an animal. A deer, maybe. But this wasn't a deer. It was too big. Too deliberate. Whatever it was moving towards us. Slowly. Deliberately. And it was big. I could sense its size in the way the darkness itself seemed to shift and thicken around it. My breath hitched in my throat. I grabbed Mika and Lucas by the arms, pulling them closer to me. Ricardo froze, his eyes wide, staring into the blackness beyond the picnic table. And then we saw it, or rather we saw the absence of light, a massive dark shape moving between us and the faint highway glow, blocking out what little light there was. It was huge, taller than any man, broader than any bear I'd ever imagined. Just a black silhouette against slightly less black night. Pure primal terror slammed into me. It wasn't rational fear, it was something deep and instinctive. Like my DNA recognized something ancient and dangerous, something it knew we were not equipped to face. I screamed. It ripped out of me before I could even think about it. "Inside! Now!" I yelled, shoving Micah and Lucas towards the office building. The only door that wasn't totally boarded up was the restroom door on the side of the building. It was flimsy, I knew it was, but it was something, anything. We scrambled to the restroom door, Ricardo right behind us, fumbling with the handle. He got it open. We practically fell inside, tripping over each other in the dark. I slammed the door shut and fumbled with the latch, desperately trying to lock it. It was one of those cheap, flimsy latches, the kind you find in public restrooms, not meant to keep anything out. But it was all we had. Ricardo managed to get the latch to catch. We huddled together in the cramped, disgusting-smelling restroom, heartbeats deafening in our ears. Micah and Lucas were pale, wide-eyed, shaking. Ricardo was breathing hard, his face white. And I was just pure terror, adrenaline coursing through me, making my hands tremble so badly I could barely feel them. Outside, the sound, the thing, was getting closer. Footsteps, but not human footsteps, too heavy, too rhythmic, bipedal. But each step landed with this earth-shaking thud, like something massive was putting its full weight down. The ground itself seemed to vibrate with each step. It was walking around the outside of the restroom, slowly, deliberately, like it was circling us. Grunts, guttural, animalistic grunts that vibrated through the thin walls, not like a bear or a mountain lion, deeper, richer, more vocal, more intelligent. In a terrifying way, the wooden walls felt thin as paper. I could imagine it, whatever it was, just ripping through the wood like it was nothing. The flimsy lock felt like a joke. We were trapped, cornered, completely helpless. We stood there, pressed against the walls, barely breathing, listening to the sounds outside. The heavy footsteps circling, the grunts low and menacing. The silence in between was just as terrifying, filled with the anticipation of... what? Of the door bursting open? Of something ripping through the wall? Of something else? Something worse? Time stretched out, distorted by fear. Minutes felt like hours. Hours felt like an eternity. The sounds outside continued, circling, grunting, footsteps, always those heavy, deliberate footsteps, around and around the small restroom. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Silence. Complete silence, except for our ragged breathing. We held our breaths, listening, straining to hear anything. Nothing. Just the wind rustling in the trees, sounding impossibly normal and peaceful after what we'd just experienced. We stayed huddled in the restroom for what felt like forever, too afraid to move, too afraid to even speak. Was it gone? Or was it just waiting? Listening? We had no idea. And then, through the darkness, we heard another sound. A sound that, just moments before, would have been utterly ordinary. A car horn, honking, repeatedly. Jean. He had finally gotten my message, or maybe he had just decided to come looking for us when I didn't come home. Hope flooded through me, so intense it was almost painful. I scrambled to the door, fumbling with the latch again, my hands still shaking uncontrollably. Ricardo helped me, his hands shaking too. We got the door open and stumbled out into the night. Jean's headlights cut through the darkness, blindingly bright. He was there. Thank God he was there. We didn't hesitate. We didn't look back. We just ran. Mika, Lucas, Ricardo and me. We sprinted to Jean's car like our lives depended on it. And maybe they did. We piled into the car, doors slamming, breath coming in ragged gasps. Jean looked at us, his face a mask of concern. What happened? Jana, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost. I couldn't even speak at first. Just shook my head, tears welling up in my eyes. Ricardo just pointed back at the restrooms, at the darkness beyond. Something was out there, Jean. Something big. Something... I don't know. Jean didn't argue. He saw our faces. He saw the terror in our eyes. He just put the car in drive and peeled out of that park office parking lot, tires spitting gravel. We didn't stop talking about it, whispering about it in the car. But even now, months later, I can't explain what we saw or what we heard. All I know is I will never ever go back to Hasik Cave Trail, and sometimes late at night when it's quiet and dark, I still hear those heavy footsteps in my dreams, circling, and I wake up in a cold sweat, the terror just as real as it was that night in Salt Lick State Park. I still can't make sense of it. I wish I could forget it. Story 2. It was a Saturday, I remember that for sure, because school was out and I was actually having fun, which wasn't always a given back then. Autumn was kicking in, the kind where the sun's still strong, but the air's got that bite to it that tells you winter's not messing around and is coming soon. Leaves were turning all those crazy colors, reds, oranges, yellows, like someone had gone nuts with paint all over the trees around our yard. We had this biggish yard backing onto woods behind our house in Ash Ridge, pretty much out in the sticks. My dad, Ricardo, he was into all that outdoorsy stuff, so he got me this air rifle, a proper one, not some toy. We'd set up cans, empty paint cans usually, out in the yard and practice shooting. It was kind of cool, learning to aim properly and feeling the little thump on my shoulder when I fired. That day, we were out there doing just that. Sun was warm on my face. Sound of the pellets hitting the cans. Normal weekend afternoon stuff. I'd just knocked over all the cans in the first round. Beginner's luck, probably. And Dad told me to go reset them further down the yard, make it a bit harder. So I walked down, picking up the cans, and that's when I saw it. Our yard sloped down a bit toward the back, into this kind of shallow dip. A ravine, really, not very deep, but enough that you couldn't see into it properly from the house. It was mostly grassy, overgrown, a bit wild. As I was putting the cans down, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, over on the side of the ravine that went up, away from our yard, toward the thicker trees. Just a flicker at first, like something big rustling in the grass. I figured maybe a deer. We got them around sometimes. But then, it wasn't a deer. This thing, whatever it was, came bursting out of the ravine. Fast, like unbelievably fast. 1 second, nothing. Next second, this massive shape was hauling itself uphill, right in front of me. I froze. Seriously, I just completely locked up. It was big. Not just tall, but bulky, massive. It's hard to explain properly even now, years later. But think of, I don't know, a bear, but standing up. And way bigger. I mean, seriously bigger than any bear I've ever seen pictures of, like cartoonishly big, but real. It was covered in hair, thick, shaggy, reddish-brown hair. Not clean, shiny hair like a dog, but matted and wild-looking. And it was tall, I mean really tall. Looking back, I'd guess at least 10 feet, maybe more. That sounds crazy, I know, but that's what it looked like to me. It was towering. It was moving so fast it was almost a blur. Just this massive reddish-brown shape powering uphill. I could hear it, the ground thumping slightly with each step, even over the blood rushing in my ears. It was making this sound too. Not a roar, not really. More like a heavy, ragged breathing mixed with like a grunt, sort of like when you see a huge animal in a nature documentary and you hear the deep, guttural sounds they make, but louder and closer. It was heading straight for the tree line at the edge of our property. We had this old, huge oak tree right at the boundary. Must have been there for hundreds of years. Thick trunk, branches everywhere. And this thing, as it got closer to the tree, it did something that still makes my skin crawl thinking about it. It didn't slow down at all. It got to the oak and it reached out, this arm, massive arm, also covered in that shaggy hair, and it grabbed onto the tree trunk. And then it used the tree to swing itself around. Like, picture a monkey swinging through trees, but this was like a monster monkey doing it with a freaking oak tree. It used that tree like a pivot, swung its body around it and just disappeared. Just vanished into the woods. Gone, like it was never even there. I stood there, frozen solid, I swear, for like a full minute. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it was going to burst out of my chest. My breath was coming in these short, gasping bursts. Everything felt wrong, like the whole world had just tilted sideways. I was still holding the paint cans. I didn't even realize it at first. They were clanking together in my hand, and that little noise was the first thing that sort of snapped me back. I dropped the cans, they scattered on the grass, and I just turned and ran. Ran back to my dad as fast as I possibly could, yelling, tripping over my own feet, just desperate to get back to him. "Dad! Dad!" I was screaming, stumbling into the yard where he was still standing with the air rifle, looking puzzled at why I'd suddenly come tearing back up the yard like a lunatic. "Benji! What the heck? What's wrong?" He looked seriously worried, which made me feel a little bit calmer just seeing his face. I tried to catch my breath, gasping for air. "Dad, I saw something. In the woods. It was huge. Hairy." I couldn't even get the words out properly. I was so shaken up. He knelt down, put his hands on my shoulders. Hey, slow down. Take a breath. What did you see, buddy? A deer? Was it a bear? No, not a bear. Bigger, much bigger. And it was hairy, reddish-brown. It stood up. Dad, it was huge. It ran right up from the ravine and it swung around the oak tree and went into the woods. I was still talking fast, my words tumbling out all jumbled up. Dad listened, his face changing from worried to, well, I don't know, disbelieving maybe, a bit amused even. He sighed, kind of chuckled. Okay, Benji, slow down. You sure you saw all that? Maybe you just startled a deer and it ran off and it looked bigger than it was because you were surprised? No, Dad. I'm telling you it wasn't a deer. It was... I don't know what it was, but it was huge and it was hairy and it ran on two legs sometimes and then it used the tree to swing. It was right there, Dad, right there. I pointed back towards the tree line, my voice rising again. He looked at me, then at the woods, then back at me. He could see I was genuinely freaked out, I think. He stopped chuckling, his face getting more serious again. Okay, he said slowly. Let's just go take a look. Show me where you saw it. He kept his hand on my shoulder as we walked back down towards the bottom of the yard. I pointed to the ravine, to the area where I'd seen the movement, then to the oak tree. He looked around, not really saying anything. He checked the ground around the oak tree, looked up into the branches. He even went down a few steps into the ravine, glancing around in the tall grass. See, I said, my voice pleading. It came from over there, ran up the hill, right past here, and then around the tree and into the woods. He straightened up, brushed off his pants. Benji, he said, his voice gentle but firm. There's nothing here. No tracks, no broken branches, nothing. You probably just imagined it. Or maybe you saw something else and your mind played tricks on you, made it bigger and scarier than it really was. You've been watching too many monster movies, you know? I wanted to argue, to shout at him that I wasn't making it up, that I really saw it. But looking around, seeing nothing, no sign of this giant creature, it started to feel a bit unreal, even to me. Maybe he was right. Maybe I had just imagined it. Scared myself with a shadow or something. Kids' imaginations can be pretty wild. We went back inside, still carrying the air rifle and the scattered paint cans. Dad tried to lighten the mood, said maybe we should watch a funny movie, take my mind off whatever I thought I saw. I agreed, but I couldn't really shake it off. The image of that massive hairy thing, the sound of its heavy breathing, the way it moved, it was burned into my brain. I kept looking out the window towards the woods, even though I knew there was nothing to see. The next day was Monday, school day. I didn't say anything about it at first. I felt silly, like Dad was right. Maybe I had just imagined it. I didn't want to sound like a crazy kid who sees monsters in the backyard. But then, in science class, Mr. Henderson, my science teacher, he was talking about local wildlife, about bears and coyotes and foxes that sometimes wandered closer to residential areas than people realized. And then he mentioned something about weird noises people had reported hearing in the woods around Ash Ridge. He was saying how people called the sheriff sometimes, reporting strange animal calls, loud crashing noises, even what sounded like tree trunks being snapped, especially out near Nicholas Road. Nicholas Road was the road that ran right past the edge of our woods. I suddenly felt this jolt, like a shock of cold water down my spine. It wasn't just me. Other people had heard things too, weird things. After class, I waited until everyone else had left, and then I went up to Mr. Henderson's desk. He was organizing papers, getting ready for the next class. Mr. Henderson, I said, feeling a bit nervous. He looked up, smiling. Hey, Benji, something I can help you with? I hesitated for a second, then just blurted it out. You were talking about those noises people hear in the woods, near Nicholas Road? Yeah, he said, looking a little curious now. Why? You heard something? I took a deep breath. Well, yeah. Saturday. I was in my backyard practicing shooting with my dad, and I saw something in the woods. I told him the whole story about seeing the creature in the ravine, how big it was, the hair, how fast it moved, the oak tree, everything. I even told him about my dad not believing me, thinking I'd imagined it. Mr. Henderson listened without interrupting, just nodding slowly as I talked. He had this serious look on his face, not like he was laughing at me or thought I was crazy. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, just looking at me. "Benji," he said finally, his voice low. "Where exactly in the woods was this? Near what part of Nicholas Road?" I described the location of our house, the ravine, the oak tree, pointed out where it would be in relation to Nicholas Road if you kept going straight back into the woods. He nodded again, even slower this time. He ran a hand over his chin, looking thoughtful. "You know," he said, almost to himself, "I've heard those noises myself. A few times, actually. Early mornings mostly, or late at night. Sounded like something big moving around out there, crashing through the undergrowth. Once, I swear I heard something like a howl, but deeper, different from any animal I know around here." He looked directly at me then, and it was always coming from that general area, back towards Nicholas Road, near where you live. I stared at him. You heard it too?" "I have," he said, "and a couple of other people I know who live out that way have mentioned it too. Weird noises, unexplained sounds from the woods." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his desk. "Benji, I'm not saying I know what you saw, but I'm also not saying you imagined it. There are things out there in the woods, in places like Ash Ridge, that we don't understand, wild places, and sometimes things happen that don't fit into our neat little boxes of what's supposed to be real." He didn't say it was a monster or a Bigfoot or anything like that, but he didn't dismiss it either. And that made all the difference. Just knowing that someone else, an adult, a teacher, someone smart, had heard weird stuff in the same area, that was like validation. It meant I wasn't completely crazy. It meant maybe, just maybe, what I saw was real. I walked home from school that day in a daze. The woods behind our house looked different now. Before, they were just woods, a place to explore sometimes, to build forts, nothing scary about them. But now they felt different, menacing almost, like they were hiding something big and hairy and unknown. Every creak of a branch, every rustle of leaves sounded different now. My imagination ran wild, filling in the blanks. I'd jump at shadows in the backyard. I couldn't shake the image of that creature. The way it moved, the sheer size of it, the unnatural speed, the sound of its breath. I still don't know what I saw. My dad still thinks I imagined it. But Mr. Henderson made me think maybe I didn't. Maybe there really was something out there, something big, something hairy, something else. I still live in Ash Ridge. I still see the woods every day. But I don't go near them anymore, not really. Not like I used to. The woods feel different. They feel watched. And every now and then, especially on still nights, when the wind is quiet, I swear I hear it. A distant sound, deep and guttural, coming from the trees. A sound like heavy breathing. Or maybe a grunt. And I remember that afternoon, that flash of reddish-brown fur, that impossible speed, that feeling of pure animal terror. And I just freeze and listen, waiting. Story 3. Look, I'm not usually one to post stuff online. Truth is, I still get freaked out thinking about it, and it's been years. But I saw a thread talking about weird stuff people have seen in rural areas, and this just popped back into my head, clear as day. So, figured maybe getting it out there would, I don't know, make it feel less like some crazy dream. It was when I was a kid, maybe 10 or 11. We lived on this farm way out in the sticks near Hollow Creek. Place was isolated. Just woods and fields and this creek that always felt kinda off. My dad was a real hard ass. Farm was his life, and we were expected to help, no questions asked. Hunting dogs, especially Duke, were like royalty. Duke was this purebred hunting dog, all muscle and smarts. Dad was always bragging about him. This particular evening, sun was starting to go down, and it was getting that dusky kind of light, you know? Not quite dark, but the shadows were getting long and weird. Dad sent me out to get Duke. He'd taken off chasing something, which he did sometimes, but usually he was back quick. This time he hadn't come back for a while, and Dad was getting pissed. He figured Duke had wandered off towards the low grounds. That's what we called this swampy, thick woods area behind our farm, bordering Route 313. Dad hated the low grounds, said it was dangerous, easy to get lost, full of snakes, and who knows what else. Now I gotta tell you, I did not want to go into the low grounds. It was already getting darkish, and that place always gave me the creeps even in broad daylight. It was like the trees were too close together. The ground was always damp, and the air just felt heavy, you know. But Dad, he wasn't the type to take no for an answer. He just pointed, told me to bring Duke back, and that was that. So, I started walking. I figured if Duke went into the low grounds, he probably went in closer to Route 313, because the fence was kinda broken down there in places. Instead of going straight through the thick stuff from our yard, all thorny bushes and overgrown weeds that would rip you to shreds, I decided to walk down our dirt road to Route 313 and cut through the gate that led to the back field. That field was right next to the low grounds, but was mostly open pasture, easier to walk through, and had that gate that opened right up close to where I figured Duke might have gone in. Route 313 was a narrow country road, barely paved, mostly used by farm trucks and locals. Nobody out there that evening, just that quiet, heavy dusk settling in. Walking along the road, I started to feel that familiar unease creeping up. It's hard to explain, but it wasn't just being scared of the dark. It was like something else was out there, watching. You know that feeling when you're alone, but you're not really alone? That. Got to the gate, rusty thing, squeaked like crazy when I opened it. The field beyond was darker than I expected. That pasture wasn't mowed regularly. It was a mix of tall grass and weeds, kinda bumpy underfoot. I called out for Duke a few times. "Duke! Here, boy! Duke!" My voice sounded too loud in the quiet evening, just crickets chirping back. Started walking deeper into the field, towards where the woods started. The low grounds was like a wall of trees and tangled bushes at the edge of the pasture. It was getting darker fast now. Shadows were playing tricks on my eyes, making every bush look like something else. I remember feeling this tightness in my chest, that prickly feeling on the back of my neck, like when you know someone is staring at you. And then I saw it. It was just there, maybe 20-30 feet ahead of me, near this thick patch of wild rose bushes, right at the edge of the woods. At first, my mind couldn't even process what I was seeing. It was just shape, big, dark shape, upright, taller than any man. Then my brain started to catch up. It was a creature, standing there, just standing. I swear my heart stopped. It was like a giant monkey, but not quite. Imagine a gorilla, but stretched out, standing straight up. It was covered in dark fur, shaggy and thick. It looked massive, heavy. Its arms were long, hanging down almost to its knees. But it was the face. God, the face. I could see it even in the dim light. It wasn't like a monkey's face, not really. More human-like in a twisted way. Heavy brow ridge, flat nose, but the eyes, they were the worst. Big, dark eyes, reflecting what little light there was, and they were just staring at me. Not angry, not really, just intently staring, like it was studying me, like I was some bug under a microscope. And then I saw Duke. He was on the other side of the rose bushes from the creature, just a few feet away. He was sitting down, looking in the opposite direction, sniffing the ground like he was tracking something, completely oblivious to it, unaware of this thing, standing right there. It was the weirdest thing. Duke, usually so alert, so protective, didn't even seem to notice it. Time just froze. Everything went silent except for the pounding in my ears. Me and this thing just staring at each other. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't move. I don't know how long it was. Felt like forever, maybe only seconds. Then, slowly, like moving through thick syrup, I started to back away. One step at a time, my eyes locked on it, never breaking contact. It didn't move, just watched me. Those eyes, I can still see them in my head sometimes, even now, that intense, cold stare. I reached the gate, fumbled with the latch, my hands shaking so bad I could barely work it. Finally, it clicked open. I slipped through, slammed the gate shut behind me, not that a rusty gate would stop anything that size, and I just ran. I ran like I've never run before, back down the dirt road towards the house. Didn't look back, didn't stop, just ran, my lungs burning, legs aching, heart pounding like it wanted to burst out of my chest. I burst through the kitchen door, gasping for air, tripping over my own feet, practically falling onto the kitchen floor. My mom was there, getting dinner ready. She looked up, startled. "Bobby, what in the world?" I couldn't even talk straight at first, just babbling, trying to get the words out. Monster, field, big, hairy, thing. She got me to sit down, gave me a glass of water. "Bobby, calm down. What happened? What are you talking about?" I finally managed to get it out, broken words, jumbled sentences, trying to describe what I'd seen. The creature, the field, Duke on the other side of the bushes, those eyes. Mum listened, her face getting more and more worried. When I finished, she just looked at me for a long time. Then she said, real quiet, "Wait here." She went out of the kitchen, calling for Dad. He came in, looking annoyed. "What's all the commotion? I heard you yelling all the way out in the barn." Then he saw my face, and I guess he realized something was wrong. "What is it, Bobby?" he asked, his voice sharper now. I told him again the whole thing, about going to get Duke, going through the gate and seeing it. I tried to describe it the best I could, the giant ape-like figure, the face, the eyes. He listened, but you could see his face hardening, his eyes narrowing. When I finished, he just let out this short, harsh laugh. "A monster? Bobby, what nonsense are you spouting? You probably saw a deer in the shadows and spooked yourself." "No, Dad, it wasn't a deer. It was huge and hairy like an ape, but bigger. It was standing up." He just scoffed. "An ape? In Hollow Creek? Don't be ridiculous, boy. You let your imagination run wild, that's all. Now stop this silly talk and go get Duke. He's still out there. And it's getting dark for real now. Go on." I just stared at him. Terror was still pumping through my veins. The image of that thing was burned into my mind, going back out there. It was unthinkable. "Dad, I can't," I whispered. My voice was shaking. I can't go back there." He just glared at me. His face went red. "What did you say to me?" His voice was low and dangerous now. "Did you just say, can't?" I'd never defied him before, not really. I was always scared of him, scared of his temper. But the fear of that thing in the field, it was stronger. It was like a wall of ice in my chest, freezing up everything else. "I can't," I repeated, my voice still shaky, but louder this time. "I saw something awful out there. I can't go back." His face twisted with rage. "You disobeying me now? You lying to me? You think you can make up some crazy story and get out of your chores? Get up, get out there and bring back that dog right now." He pointed at the door. His hand was trembling with anger, but I didn't move. I just stood there, frozen, staring at the floor. And for the first time in my life, I didn't do what he told me to do. He yelled, he cursed, he threatened to whip me, everything. But I just stood there, shaking my head. "No," I kept saying, "no, I can't." He finally saw it in my eyes, I think. He saw I wasn't making it up. He saw the real fear there. His anger didn't go away, but it changed, became something else, something uneasy. He didn't make me go back out there. He stormed out of the house himself, slamming the door behind him, and went out to look for Duke. Mom just stood there, watching me, her face pale. She put her hand on my shoulder, real gentle, but she didn't say anything. Dad was gone a long time. It got completely dark. Mom lit more lamps in the house, and the shadows danced on the walls. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside the window made me jump. I kept thinking about that creature, standing there in the field. Those eyes. He came back late. No Duke. He was silent, didn't say a word to me. Just went straight to his room and slammed the door. Mom tried to talk to him later, but I heard them arguing, muffled voices from their bedroom. Duke came back the next morning, scratched up and tired, but okay. Dad never said anything about it, never mentioned Duke being gone, never mentioned anything about what happened the night before. It was like it never happened. We just went back to farm work like normal, like nothing was different, but everything was different. For me, anyway. I couldn't shake the image of that creature. I'd lie awake at night, staring into the darkness, imagining those eyes staring back at me. I avoided that field, avoided the low grounds like the plague. Every shadow looked like it. Every sound in the woods made me jump. And you know what the weirdest part is? Years later, after we moved away from Hollow Creek, I heard stories, whispers really, from people who still lived there or knew people who did. Stories about strange things seen out in the woods. About a woman who lived down Route 313, near the low grounds, who swore she saw a hairy face peering into her kitchen window one night. About a road worker who saw something crossing the road in the dark, something big and dark and moving on two legs. People mostly dismissed them as local folklore, crazy stories, you know. But I knew what I saw, and thinking about those other stories, those whispers, it makes you wonder. Wonder what else is out there, in the dark places in the woods, that we don't understand. Wonder if it's still there, out by Hollow Creek, maybe still watching, waiting in the shadows. I still can't explain it, and I don't think I ever will, but I know what I saw that evening, and I'll never forget it. Story 4. It's still messed up in my head, you know. Even now, years later, when I think about it, a cold wave just washes over me. People talk about things that scare them, spiders, heights, public speaking. For me, it's the woods behind my house. Always has been since that day. It started, funny enough, on Christmas. Not even Christmas Day, but the party before, the neighborhood get-together thing. I was maybe 12, something like that. Still a kid, but not a baby anymore. We were at the Henderson's place, down the street. It was freezing, like proper December cold, the kind that bites through your coat even when you think you're wrapped up warm. Snow was coming down hard, thick flakes swirling around under the porch lights. We were heading home, my folks and me, making that dash from the warm party back to our own front door. Everyone was hurrying, heads down, trying to get out of the storm. But me, I always dawdle. I remember lagging behind, looking around, you know, kid stuff. And that's when I felt it, that weird tingle on the back of your neck like someone's watching you. I stopped, just for a second. The snow was still falling, the streetlights fuzzy and blurry. Our house was just a few doors down, the warm glow of the windows promising hot chocolate and warmth. But something made me look over towards the neighbor's yard, Mr. Peterson's place. He had that big old barn at the back of his property. Used to keep horses years ago, I think. They had a floodlight near it, a really powerful one, shining out over the yard. And there, standing near the barn, in the edge of the light, was this thing. At first, it just looked like a shadow, dark against the snow, but as my eyes adjusted, I saw it clearer. It was huge, black, and it was standing upright, like a person. Taller than a person, way taller, like 7, maybe 8 feet tall. It was bulky, thick, and the light caught something furry. It was covered in dark fur. My brain just kind of glitched. My first thought, honest to God, was gorilla. A giant gorilla, standing in Mr. Peterson's yard in the middle of a snowstorm. It was so out of place, so utterly wrong, it didn't even feel real. It just stood there, still as a statue, facing... well, I don't know if it was facing me exactly, but its general direction was towards me. I just stared. I was frozen, not from the cold, but from... I don't even know what. Shock, maybe. Fear, creeping in slow. My parents were already at our door, fumbling with the keys, calling for me to hurry up. The light wasn't great, the snow was heavy, and it all happened so fast. Just a glimpse, a weird, impossible image burned into my brain. Then my dad yelled again, louder this time, and I snapped out of it. I ran like hell to the house, slamming the door shut behind me, the warmth inside hitting me like a wall. I didn't say anything to my parents. I don't know why. Maybe I was too freaked out. Maybe I thought they wouldn't believe me. Maybe I even thought I hadn't seen anything at all, that it was just my kid imagination playing tricks in the snow and shadows. Anyway, Christmas went on. Presents, food, all that stuff. The gorilla thing just kind of faded in my mind, tucked away somewhere in the back. Until a few years later. It was autumn, not winter. Completely different time of year. I was maybe 15, 16 then. More grown up, thought I knew everything. I was outside in our backyard, kicking a soccer ball around by myself, just messing about. The leaves were turning, that golden brown, crunchy kind, and the air had that sharp, clean autumn smell. I'd just seen some stupid show on TV about Bigfoot the night before. One of those cheesy documentaries, full of blurry photos and people talking about footprints and sightings. I'd laughed at it, honestly, thought it was ridiculous. Bigfoot. Yeah, right. Then it happened. I kicked the ball a bit too hard, and it rolled towards the woods behind our house. We backed right onto the woods, pretty thick woods too, goes on for miles back there. I went to get it, heading towards the edge of the trees, and then I heard it. Thwack, thwack, like someone hitting a tree with something. Not an axe, not chopping wood. It was a duller, heavier sound, like hitting a tree trunk with a big log. It came from deeper in the woods, not far, maybe 50 yards in. I stopped dead. The ball lay forgotten at my feet. Thwack, thwack. It was regular, rhythmic, like something was banging on the trees on purpose. I stood there listening, the hairs on my arms starting to stand up. It wasn't just the sound, it was the feeling, like something was off, wrong. Then the sound changed. It got louder, closer. Crack. Then a huge, tearing, splintering noise like a giant tree branch snapping. Except it kept going, that cracking, ripping sound, getting louder and louder, closer and closer, and then, with a deafening crash, it happened. A tree went down, a big one. You could feel it in the ground, that thud and rumble as it fell. I stood there, frozen again, but this time it wasn't just shock, it was pure, cold terror. My heart was hammering in my chest, so loud I could hear it over the rustling of the leaves. The woods suddenly went silent. No more thwack sounds, just quiet, too quiet. And then something moved. In the trees where the tree had fallen, movement, dark and quick. At first, I didn't see what it was, just shadows, shifting branches. Then a deer burst out of the woods, a white-tailed deer doe, I think. It came crashing through the undergrowth, running full speed, eyes wide, panicked. It ran right across my backyard, towards the open fields behind the neighbors' houses, legs pumping, breathing hard. It was terrified, you could see it. It wasn't just running, it was fleeing for its life. And then I saw what it was running from. It came out of the woods just after the deer, moving fast, faster than anything that size should move. It wasn't running exactly, more like surging through the trees, a dark shape, low to the ground, then upright, weaving between the trunks, branches snapping out of its way. It was black, completely black, covered in hair, long, shaggy black hair, massive, taller than a man, thicker, broader. It moved with this incredible speed and power. It flowed through the trees like water, but it was solid, heavy. You could feel the weight of it even from where I was standing. It was the same thing I'd seen that Christmas night, the same dark, massive shape, but this time it was in broad daylight. Well, not broad daylight, it was late afternoon, starting to get dusky, but still, you could see it. You could see it clearly. This wasn't a shadow. This wasn't my imagination. This was real. Terror. That's the only word for it. Not just fear, terror, like every instinct in my body screamed danger. Primal fear, the kind that shuts down your brain and just makes you react. I didn't think, I didn't breathe, I just ran. I turned and bolted for the house faster than I've ever run in my life. I didn't even grab the soccer ball. I just ran, adrenaline pumping, legs burning. The image of that black shape burned into my eyes. I burst through the back door, slamming it behind me, heart hammering, gasping for air. My mum was in the kitchen, turning around, startled. "Cody, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." Ghost? If only it was a ghost. I couldn't speak at first. Just stood there, chest heaving, trying to get air back into my lungs. "Woods!" I finally managed to get out, voice shaky. "Something in the woods." She looked at me, worried now. "What? What is it, a bear? Did you see a bear?" "A bear? God, I wish it was just a bear. Bears are scary, sure, but you know what a bear is. You understand bears. This wasn't a bear. This was something else, something ancient, something wrong." "No," I said, finally getting my voice back a little. "Not a bear, something big, black, hairy, like a monster." She frowned, looking at me like I'd lost my mind. "Cody, what are you talking about? Are you playing a joke?" I shook my head, tears pricking at my eyes. I was shaking all over, still terrified, still feeling that primal fear clawing at me. "I saw it, Mom. I really saw it. It was chasing a deer. It was huge." She came over and put her hands on my shoulders, looking at me intently. Okay, calm down. Just tell me slowly. What did you see?" I tried to explain, stumbling over words, trying to describe the black shape, the speed, the size, the feeling of pure dread it had instilled in me. I told her about the thwacking sounds, the tree falling, the deer, everything. She listened, her face getting more and more serious. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, just looking at me. Then she said softly, "Cody, maybe you just saw a bear. Maybe it was just bigger than you thought. Sometimes things look different in the woods." I wanted to believe her, I really did, but I knew what I'd seen. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a deer, it wasn't anything I'd ever seen in my life before, and it was definitely the same thing from that Christmas night years ago. The gorilla in the snow, but now real and in the woods behind our house. The deer. I never saw it again. I went back outside later. When my dad got home, we went to look in the woods. He humored me mostly, but he was armed, just in case. We found the fallen tree, a big oak, ripped right out of the ground. And we found nothing else. No tracks, no broken branches other than the tree fall. Nothing to explain what I'd seen. No deer, no monster. My dad said it was probably just a bear, maybe a really big one, that had startled the deer. He said I was probably just scared and imagining things, and I tried to believe him. I really tried, but deep down I knew what I'd seen. And you know what? The woods behind our house, they never felt the same after that. Never. Even in the daytime, even on sunny days, I could feel it. That cold, creeping feeling of being watched. Like something was out there, lurking in the trees, hidden in the shadows, watching, waiting. It's been years since then. I moved away for college, then work. I don't live in Riverton anymore, but I still think about it. I still remember that black shape in the woods, the feeling of terror, the way it moved. And every time I visit my parents, every time I go back to that house, I avoid the backyard. I never go near the woods. And at night I can't help but look out the windows towards the trees, wondering if it's still out there, watching, waiting. And the thing is, I know I saw something. I know it wasn't just my imagination. And I know deep down that whatever it wasn't normal. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything we understand. And that's the scariest part. Because if that's out there, if things like that really exist, what else is lurking in the dark corners of the world, hidden from our eyes? What else are we not seeing? I don't know, and I don't want to know. But sometimes, late at night, when everything's quiet and the wind whispers through the trees outside, I swear I can still hear those thwack sounds echoing from the woods. And then, nothing, just silence. And that silence, that's the worst part of all, because it makes you wonder what's listening back. Story 5. Okay, so, thinking about this thing that happened back in Meadowbrook still messes with me, even after all these years. It was the summer of '82, and man, that summer heat was brutal. You know, the kind that sticks to you like glue and makes the air thick, almost heavy to breathe. We lived just outside of Meadowbrook, kind of in the woods, and had this long dirt driveway leading up to our house. It was a Friday, I remember, because school was out, and we were all just trying to find ways to kill time and stay cool. My sisters Sarah and Emily were maybe 9 and 7 then, and I was around 12. Kids, basically. We were bored out of our minds. I had this old beat-up Ford Pinto. Yeah, I know, a Pinto, but it ran. And for a kid, it was freedom. Anyway, I was being the cool older brother, letting them ride on the hood while I slowly cruised up our driveway. Not smart, I know, looking back, but we were kids, and it was fun at the time. We were laughing, hair blowing in the wind, just being dumb kids. Then, everything changed in a split second. Sarah, she was always the more dramatic one, but Emily, she was usually pretty quiet, and they both started screaming at the same time. Loud, panicked screams that just cut right through the sunny afternoon. I slammed on the brakes, engine sputtering, and I remember thinking they'd seen a snake or something. We had snakes all the time, copperheads, black rat snakes, the usual, but this was different. They were scrambling off the hood like it was on fire, pointing over towards this field that ran alongside our property. It was tall grass, overgrown, the kind of field my dad always said he was going to get around to mowing, but never did. I turned, looking where they were pointing, my heart starting to pound. For a second, I didn't see anything, just the tall grass waving slightly in the breeze. Then it moved again, further in, deeper in the field. And that's when I saw it. I don't even know how to describe it properly still. It was big, really big, like way bigger than any person, bigger than any animal I'd ever seen around there, except maybe a cow, but this was nothing like a cow. It was standing upright, walking through the field, and it was covered in fur, hair, something thick and reddish-brown. It was moving slow but purposeful, like it knew exactly where it was going, even though there was nothing but field there. My mind just blanked out for a second. I mean, you just don't expect to see something like that. In broad daylight, right there, in your own backyard practically. I stood there frozen, with Sarah and Emily clinging to my legs, both still sobbing and pointing. I watched it move across the field, maybe 100 yards away, maybe less. It's hard to judge distance when you're that freaked out. It was heading towards the woods on the other side of the field, and then it was just gone, swallowed up by the trees like it had vanished into thin air. We all stood there, just staring at the empty field for what felt like forever, but was probably just a few minutes. The air suddenly felt different, colder, even though it was still blazing hot outside. The silence was heavy, except for my sister's sniffles and my own heart pounding in my chest. We ran inside, of course, like bats out of hell. My mum was in the kitchen making lunch or something. We just burst in, babbling all at once, trying to explain what we'd seen. Kids, you know how we are. excited and terrified all mixed together, words tumbling out in a rush. Mom, naturally, didn't believe us at first. She thought we'd seen a bear or a deer or something, tried to calm us down, told us we were just imagining things. But we were persistent. We kept describing it, the size, the color, how it walked upright. Finally, she saw we were genuinely scared and not just making it up. She sat us down, listened properly, asked us questions, and then she told us something that made my blood run cold. She said, weeks before, maybe a month, she'd been driving down Willow Creek Road, which was near our place, and she'd seen something similar. She hadn't told us before because she thought she'd imagined it, or maybe it was just her eyes playing tricks on her in the heat. But she described seeing something tall and hairy cross the road in front of her car, so fast, she said it only took 2 huge strides to get from one side to the other. She said it was like nothing she'd ever seen before, and she'd just put it out of her mind, figured she was stressed or tired. Hearing her say that after what we'd just seen, that's when it started to feel real, you know? Like we weren't just kids with overactive imaginations. It didn't stop there either. Mr. Henderson, our neighbor who lived down the road, he was an old guy, a bit gruff, not someone who made things up. A few days later, my dad was talking to him by the mailbox, and Mr. Henderson brought it up himself. He said he'd been having trouble with raccoons getting into his shed at night, so he'd been staying up late, trying to catch them. And one night, he said he'd seen something jump off the roof of his shed. He said it was big and dark, and it landed with a heavy thud that shook the whole shed. He didn't see it clearly, it was dark, but he was spooked bad. He didn't know what it was, but he was rattled, said it wasn't any animal he knew. My dad didn't really connect it then, but after we told him about what we saw, and knowing about Mom's sighting, and then Mr. Henderson's thing, it started to piece together. Summer went on, but it was different. There was this unease in the air. Every shadow seemed a little darker. Every rustle in the woods sounded louder. We didn't play outside as much. We stayed closer to the house. My dad started locking the doors earlier at night, which he never used to do. We'd hear things at night, you know, noises in the woods. But it was hard to tell if it was just normal animal noises or something else. Everything felt amplified by fear. Then nothing happened. Summer ended, school started, life went back to some kind of normal. We didn't see anything else. We sort of started to forget about it, or maybe just push it to the back of our minds. But it was still there, that little seed of fear planted in our heads. Fast forward to '88, 6 years later. I was 18 then, just about to graduate high school, still living at home. That summer was hot too, but different somehow. Maybe because I was older, more aware of things, but it felt different, more charged. Late summer, maybe August. It was a Saturday night. Me and my buddy Mark, we were hanging out at my place, bored again, naturally. We were into smoking cigarettes back then, dumb kids again. We went outside to light up, just to get out of the house. It was dark, no moon that night. Just stars. We were standing in the driveway near the road, just talking about nothing much. You know, girls, cars, whatever. It was quiet, real quiet. You know how it gets sometimes in the country, that deep, heavy silence that seems to press in on you. Just the crickets chirping, maybe an owl hooting way off in the distance. Then it happened. A scream. Not just any scream, but a scream that just tore through the silence like a knife. High-pitched, piercing, full of pain and terror, like someone was being tortured. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It didn't sound human, but it was close. Like a human sound, twisted and stretched and made wrong. It was coming from down the road, from the direction of the old quarry. The quarry. It was abandoned, had been for years. Just a big hole in the ground, mostly filled with water now, surrounded by woods. We used to sneak down there sometimes as kids, to mess around, throw rocks, dare each other to swim in the murky water. It was a creepy place even in daylight, but at night it was something else. Mark and I just froze, cigarettes halfway to our mouths. The scream had cut us both to the bone. It died away, leaving that heavy silence even heavier now, if that makes sense. We looked at each other, eyes wide in the dark. "What the hell was that?" Mark whispered, his voice shaky. I didn't know what to say. I just shook my head. But that seed of fear from 82, it just exploded inside me. I knew somehow, deep down, that whatever we'd heard, it wasn't good. Curiosity, dumb teenage curiosity, took over. Or maybe it was something else, some kind of morbid fascination. Whatever it was, we started walking down the road towards the quarry. Slowly at first, then faster, drawn in by something we couldn't explain. The quarry was maybe half a mile down the road. As we got closer, the air started to feel different again. Thick, heavy, almost metallic, and cold. A deep, penetrating cold that went right through you, even though it was still summer night warm. The silence had gone now, replaced by a different kind of sound. Footsteps, heavy footsteps, in the woods alongside the road. But we couldn't see anyone, just the trees, dark shapes against the starlight. The footsteps were keeping pace with us, though. Heavy, deliberate, like something big walking through the undergrowth. We'd stop, listen. The footsteps would stop too. We'd start walking again. They'd start again. It was like something was walking with us, just out of sight, mimicking our movements. My heart was pounding now, hard enough to hurt. My mouth was dry, and I could feel sweat trickling down my back, even though I was freezing cold. I wanted to turn back so bad. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run. But I was frozen, pulled forward by something I didn't understand. Mark was walking next to me, pale as a ghost, his eyes wide and darting around. He was terrified too, I could see it. We got to the quarry entrance, a gap in the trees leading down a short path. The quarry itself was lower down, a kind of bowl in the land. We stopped at the edge of the path, looking down. The quarry was partly lit by starlight reflecting off the water. It looked black, still, like a dark mirror reflecting nothing. Then Mark grabbed my arm hard. His fingers dug into my skin. He was pointing down into the quarry, his hand shaking so much he could barely keep it steady. What is that?" he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. I followed his gaze, looking down into the quarry. And then I saw it. Standing at the edge of the water, near the far side of the quarry, was a figure. Tall, impossibly tall, standing upright just there. It was dark, a solid black shape against the slightly lighter blackness of the quarry water and the starlight sky. I couldn't make out details, not clearly, but I could see the silhouette, the sheer size of it. It was massive, towering, and it was just standing there, motionless, looking in our direction. Fear hit me then, a wave of pure, primal terror that slammed into me and knocked the breath out of my lungs. It wasn't just fear of the unknown. It was something deeper, something ancient, a feeling that went beyond reason, beyond understanding. It was pure, unadulterated dread. You don't want to know," I choked out, my voice barely audible. That was all I could manage to say, just those words and the feeling of utter, paralyzing terror. And then we ran. We didn't say anything else. We just turned and ran, back the way we'd come, as fast as we could. We didn't even look back. We ran blindly, desperately, fueled by nothing but pure terror. The heavy footsteps in the woods started again, echoing our panicked flight. But this time they sounded closer, louder, more urgent, like whatever was making them was chasing us. We ran all the way back to my house, didn't stop until we burst through the front door, gasping for air, hearts hammering in our chests. We slammed the door shut, locked it, bolted it, every lock we could find, even though it was probably useless against whatever we'd just seen. And then the smell hit us, a smell that I'll never forget. Foul, sickeningly sweet, but also sulphurous. Rotten eggs, mixed with something else, something indescribably vile and wrong. It filled the air around us, stinging our nostrils, making our stomachs churn. It was thick, cloying, and it seemed to seep into everything. It clung to our clothes, our skin, even our hair. It was everywhere. The smell came from us. It had followed us back, or we'd brought it back with us. We stood there in the hallway of my house, shaking, breathing hard, gagging on the smell, and staring at each other in disbelief and horror. We couldn't speak. We couldn't think straight. We just stood there, paralyzed by fear and that awful, nauseating stench. And then, just like that, it was gone. The sightings, the screams, the footsteps, the smell, everything stopped, abruptly, just like it had started. The next day the sun came up and Meadowbrook was Meadowbrook again, quiet, peaceful, normal, except it wasn't for me, not anymore. I still think about it, all the time. What did we see that day in the field in '82? What was that thing at the quarry in '88? What was that scream? What was that smell? I have no answers. Nobody does. I've tried to rationalize it, tried to explain it away, but I can't. It doesn't fit into anything normal, anything explainable. It was real. I know it was real. We all saw it. We all felt it. Meadowbrook. It looks the same. Quiet, peaceful, innocent. But for me, it's always going to be different. It's got this shadow over it. A place where things can come out of the darkness, things you don't understand, things you don't want to know. And sometimes, late at night, when it's really quiet and the air is still and cold, I still think I can smell it. Just a faint whiff, a ghost of that sulphurous stench, reminding me it was real, and that it's still out there, somewhere in the dark. Story 6. I swear, even now, years later, typing this out is making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was fall of 2015, October, I think, because the air had that bite to it already, you know, that crisp, cold edge that means winter is just around the corner. I was working logging up in Cypress County, way out there, near State Highway 140. Anyone who knows that area knows how remote it is. Trees for days, man. Real thick woods. Gorgeous in a way, but also isolated. Really isolated. I was cutting old growth, giants, the kind of trees that make you feel small just standing next to them. It was supposed to rain later. The sky was that heavy, grey, bruised color, pressing down on everything. Usually I like days like that. The dampness kind of softens the forest sounds, makes everything quieter, except for the hum of the saw and the crack of wood. But that day, something was off from the jump. I just felt jittery, like when you know you've forgotten something important, but you can't put your finger on it. It was more than that, though. It was like being watched. That prickly feeling on your skin. I tried to shake it off. Started up the steel. That familiar roar usually grounds me, makes me focus on the work. Felling trees, it's a physical job. You gotta be in your body, in the moment. But even with the saw screaming in my hands, I couldn't get rid of this crawling sensation, this feeling of eyes on me. I kept glancing around between cuts like an idiot. Figured maybe the foreman was checking up on me, making sure I was meeting quota, even though I was way ahead. But no one. Just trees, branches, the damp undergrowth, that heavy sky looking like it was about to burst. Nothing but the forest. And still, that feeling. It was when I was starting on a big oak, a real monster, that it happened. I'd just sunk the bucking cut, getting ready to wedge it and drop it right where I wanted. I paused for a second to catch my breath and adjust my footing. And that's when I saw it. Off to my right, maybe 50 yards, 60 at most, standing behind this massive pine, thicker than any I'd cut all day. It was a shape, just a dark shape at first. But then my eyes adjusted, and I realized it wasn't just a shadow or a weird tree trunk. It was something else. It was tall, unnaturally tall. I mean, the trees in this section were giants, but this thing, it made even the big pines look normal. It was darker than the shadows, a deep, solid brown, almost black in the dim light under the canopy. And it was just there, still, like a statue carved from night. My blood just went cold, not like metaphorically cold. I mean actually cold, like someone had dumped ice water right into my veins. My heart slammed against my ribs, so hard I could feel it in my throat. I froze, saw still idling in my hand, the vibrations buzzing right through me, but I was completely locked up. It was just watching me. I couldn't see eyes, not really, but I felt them. I know that sounds crazy, but it's the only way I can describe it, like it was just observing, studying me. There was no movement from it, no twitch, no blink, nothing. Just this huge, silent form, hidden just enough behind the tree that if I hadn't just happened to look in that exact direction, at that exact second, I would have completely missed it. The forest went silent too. Or maybe my ears just cut everything else out. The usual forest sounds. The rustle of leaves, the distant birds, the little scurrying noises. They all just faded away. It was just me and that thing, and the heavy, still air. It felt like time stopped, like everything just held its breath. I stood there, I don't know how long, maybe seconds, maybe minutes, staring at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My mind was racing, trying to find something, anything to explain it. Shadow play, some trick of the light, a bear standing on its hind legs, but none of it fit. Bears don't get that tall, and they move, they make noise. This thing was just static, solid, and utterly terrifyingly silent. Finally, my brain, or maybe just instinct, kicked in. I told myself I was being stupid. It was probably just a shadow, my eyes playing tricks. Yeah, that's it. Just shadows. I had to get back to work. Couldn't afford to fall behind. Rain was coming. We needed to get this section cleared before the ground turned to mud. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself down. Started fiddling with the wedge, pretended to ignore it. Started the saw up again, full throttle, the roar tearing through the silence. The noise was almost a relief. It broke the spell, sort of. But my eyes, they kept drifting back. Over and over again, I'd glance over to where it had been, even as I was making the final felling cut. As the oak groaned and started to lean, my eyes kept snapping back to that spot behind the pine. And each time I looked, it was still there. Just standing there, unmoving, watching. I got the tree down, finally. It hit the ground with a heavy thump, shaking the earth. Dust and bits of bark flew up. The sound echoed in the stillness, but the shape behind the pine, it didn't react, didn't flinch, didn't even seem to notice. I started limbing the oak, going through the motions, but I was completely distracted. My hands were clumsy, my cuts were ragged. I was jumpy as hell. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me flinch and spin around. And my eyes, they just couldn't stay away from that dark spot in the trees. Then, the first fat drops of rain started to fall. Plunk, plunk, plunk on the leaves above, the sky finally breaking. I figured, okay, rain's here, gotta pack it in soon anyway. Maybe this was a sign to just call it a day. I glanced over to the pine again, almost against my will, and this time, it was gone. Just gone. Like it had vanished into thin air. 1 second it was there, that solid, dark presence, and the next, empty space between the trees. Just trees and shadows and falling rain. My breath caught in my chest. I scanned the trees, desperately searching for any sign of it. Maybe it had moved deeper into the woods. Maybe it was still there, just further back, harder to see in the gloom and the rain that was starting to pick up. But no, nothing. Just empty forest. The rain started coming down harder, real heavy now, a proper downpour. Washing everything, soaking the ground, blurring the edges of the woods, any chance of seeing tracks, of figuring out what the hell I'd seen, gone, washed away with the first heavy drops. I stood there for a moment, in the pouring rain, staring at the empty space where it had been, completely numb. My heart was still pounding, but now it was mixed with this confusion. disbelief. Was I hallucinating? Did I just imagine the whole thing? But it felt so real, so solid. That darkness, that silence, that feeling of being watched. It couldn't have been made up. I finally snapped out of it, the cold rain soaking me to the bone. I figured, rain like this, work's done for the day anyway. Time to head back. I packed up my gear, the saw, the wedges, everything, loaded it all back onto the skidder, feeling like I was moving through a dream. Everything felt unreal. Driving back down the logging roads, the rain hammering the cab of the skidder, I kept replaying it in my head. The shape, the silence, the watching, how tall it was. I tried to estimate its height again. Next to those trees, 8 feet easy, maybe taller. Definitely taller than any man, any bear, anything I'd ever seen. And the color, that deep, dark brown, like earth or tree bark, but somehow different, more solid, more alive. No sound. That's what really got to me. Absolutely no sound. Not a rustle of leaves, not a snap of a branch. No breathing, no scent, nothing. Just that silent, watchful presence. It was like a ghost, but made of something real, something solid. I didn't say anything to the foreman when I got back. Just clocked out, got in my truck, and drove home in the rain, completely soaked and completely rattled. My wife, Sarah, she noticed something was wrong right away. I guess I looked like I'd seen a ghost because I basically had. I told her about it that night, after the kids were asleep. Started out hesitant, expecting her to laugh, to tell me I was imagining things, that I was stressed out, working too hard. But she just listened, quietly, didn't interrupt. When I was done, she just looked at me, her eyes serious. And she didn't laugh, didn't tell me I was crazy. She just said, "You really saw something, didn't you?" And I knew right then that she believed me. That made it a little easier somehow, but it didn't make it any less weird or any less unsettling. For weeks after that, I couldn't shake it. Every time I went back in the woods, that feeling was there, that edge of unease, that sense of being watched. I'd catch myself glancing around, searching the shadows, half expecting to see that dark shape standing there again. I started doing some research. I know, sounds dumb, but I had to figure out what it could have been. Started looking online, reading about local wildlife, about, things like Bigfoot. Yeah, I know, sounds crazy, right? I used to laugh at that stuff, scoff at people who believed in all that nonsense. Bigfoot, aliens, ghosts, fairy tales for idiots. But now, after what I saw, I'm not so sure. I started reading stories, online forums, accounts from people who claim to have seen things, creatures, in the woods. And some of the stories, they were chillingly similar to what I experienced. Silent watchers in the trees, tall, dark shapes, no sounds, no smells, just presence. I became kind of obsessed with it, honestly. Spent hours online, reading, searching, trying to find some kind of explanation, some kind of logic. Tried to find reports of bear sightings in the area, unusual animal activity, anything that could explain what I saw. But nothing. Just silence. And more stories. Stories that made my blood run cold. I still don't know what it was. To this day, I have no explanation. Was it Bigfoot? Some other kind of creature? Was it just my mind playing tricks? Stress, fatigue, bad lighting, a weird shadow that my brain twisted into something it wasn't. I wish I knew. I honestly do. Because the worst part isn't the fear or the confusion. It's the question, the constant gnawing question in the back of my mind. What was it? What was watching me from the trees that day? And more than that, why? Was it just curious? Observing a strange creature in its territory, me chopping down trees? Or was it something else? Something predatory? Was it just watching, waiting for something? I don't know, and I don't think I ever will. But I'll tell you one thing. I don't go into the woods alone anymore. Not ever. And whenever I'm working out there, even with a crew, even in broad daylight, I still catch myself glancing around, still scanning the shadows, still listening for nothing. Because that's what scares me the most, I think. The silence. The complete, utter, unnatural silence that surrounded that thing, that shape in the trees. It's a silence I'll never forget. And it still haunts me every time I step foot in the woods. Story 7. Okay, so, I don't usually talk about this stuff. It's just weird, And honestly, talking about it makes me feel jumpy all over again. But I saw some posts on here about weird stuff happening out in the sticks, and it kind of reminded me of something that happened to me a long time ago. Figured maybe someone out there might get it, might know what I'm talking about, or at least understand why I still get a knot in my stomach thinking about it. It was October 1974. I was maybe 16, something like that. I'd gone out to stay with my grandma at Raven's Roost. Raven's Roost was a real tiny place. Basically, you drove for miles and miles, and then you drove some more, and then you were there, middle of nowhere. Woods all around, dirt roads mostly, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone and nothing much ever happened, except maybe a deer getting into someone's garden or old man Hemmings losing another cow. Peaceful, quiet. That's why I liked going. City got too much sometimes. Grandma's house was way out of town, even for Raven's Roost standards. You took a turn off a few miles before the town sign, down a gravel road that went on, past fields and more woods, until you finally got to her place. She had a small house, real old, kinda creaky but solid. Big porch all the way around, swing on one side, rocking chairs on the other. Back porch looked out onto the woods, just trees as far as you could see. No neighbors close by, just the sounds of nature, which normally was exactly what I went there for. This particular night it was dark, real dark. That deep country dark where you can't even see your hand in front of your face if the moon's not out. And this night the moon was hiding, big time. Inside Grandma's house it was cozy enough. She always kept a fire going in the wood stove, even if it wasn't that cold. Just because she liked it, I guess. Smelled like wood smoke and cinnamon, always. We'd had supper, nothing fancy, just soup and bread. Grandma wasn't much of a cook, but everything tasted good when you were out there, away from all the city noise and rush. We were sitting in the living room, listening to the radio, some old-timey country music station she always had on, and she was knitting, like she always did. I was just reading a book, nothing scary, some cheesy romance novel I'd picked up at the drugstore. It must have been around 10:30 p.m., maybe a little later. Getting close to bedtime for Grandma anyway. Then it happened. This sound, it just cut through everything, like a woman screaming, but not exactly. Higher pitched maybe, and just loud, piercing. It made your teeth ache loud. It ripped right through the quiet of the night. We both jumped. Grandma dropped her knitting needles. They clattered on the wooden floor. The radio kept playing its cheerful tune, but it was like it was a million miles away compared to that sound. It came again, louder this time, definitely screams, and they sounded like they were coming from outside, close outside. My heart started pounding in my chest. Grandma went white as a sheet. Her eyes got real big. She wasn't someone who scared easy. She'd lived out there her whole life, seen all kinds of stuff, wild animals and whatnot. But this spooked her bad. "Silas! Jeremiah!" she called out, her voice shaking a little. Silas was my grandpa, and Jeremiah was my uncle, Grandma's son. They were out back in the small barn, doing something with, I don't even remember, fixing a tractor or something, men's stuff. They came running in pretty fast. Grandpa was carrying his old shotgun, the one he used for hunting deer, and Uncle Jeremiah had his own shotgun, maybe a little newer. They looked serious, grim. "What is it, Ma?" Grandpa asked, his voice low and rough. Grandma just pointed towards the back door, towards the woods, her hand trembling. Screaming. Something screaming outside. Grandpa and Uncle Jeremiah exchanged a look. The kind of look men get when they know something's not right, something bad. They didn't say anything, just checked their shotguns, making sure they were loaded. They were. 12 gauge, both of them. Serious firepower for back then, even now. "Come on, Elena," Uncle Jeremiah said, not looking at me, just heading for the back door. Grandpa was right behind him. I hesitated for a second. I didn't want to go outside. Whatever was screaming out there, it didn't sound like anything good. But I wasn't going to stay in the house by myself while they went out to face whatever it was. So I followed. Nervously. Real nervously. We went out onto the back porch. It was pitch black. You couldn't see anything past the edge of the porch in the direction of the woods. The screams had stopped for a second, but then they started again. Closer now, it sounded like. Coming from just beyond the trees, right at the edge of the yard. They were horrible sounds, like pain and anger and something else, something animal, but not animal like anything I'd ever heard. Grandpa and Uncle Jeremiah moved slowly, carefully, off the porch and into the yard. They kept their shotguns raised, pointed towards the sound. I stayed close behind them, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would jump out of my chest. I was trying to see something, anything in the dark, but it was just blackness, broken only by the faint glow of the windows from the house behind us, and the sound, that awful screaming, echoing in the night. We were moving towards the edge of the woods when suddenly something heavy landed. Thump. Just behind us, over by the big oak tree in the front yard. It was so loud, it made us all jump again, even Grandpa and Uncle Jeremiah, who were trying to be all tough and brave. We spun around, and that's when we saw it. Or, well, we sort of saw it, because it was still so dark, you know, but there was something there, something huge, by the oak tree. At first, in the panic, in the dark, I thought, I don't know what I thought. Maybe a bear, or a mountain lion, something big and wild. We had them out in Raven's Roost every now and then, but this was different. It was standing up, erect, like a person, but way too big. It started to stand. If it had been crouched down before, I don't know. But it was getting taller, taller than any man, taller than even Uncle Jeremiah, who was a big guy, and wider, bulkier. It was a shadow mostly in the dark, but you could see the shape of it. And it wasn't like any animal shadow I'd ever seen. Then it moved. It took a step forward, out of the shadow of the oak tree and into a slightly more open area. And that's when I got a better look, just for a split second before everything went crazy. It was tall, incredibly tall. Grandpa was maybe 6 feet tall. Uncle Jeremiah maybe a little taller. This thing, it was towering over them. Easily 8 feet tall, maybe more. And bulky, muscular maybe, covered in something dark, like fur, thick, matted fur. I couldn't see its face clearly, just the vague outline of a head, kind of rounded, and eyes, reflective eyes. They caught the faint light from the house windows, and they seemed to glow, yellow maybe, or amber. I can't be sure. It just stood there for a moment, just looking at us, or at least it seemed like it was looking at us. Then, without making a sound, not even a footstep that I heard, it just moved. It turned away from us and walked towards the back of the yard, towards Grandma's vegetable garden. And then it just jumped. We had a fence around the garden, a wooden fence, about chest high on me, maybe 4 feet. Nothing special, just to keep the rabbits out. This thing, it just cleared it, like it wasn't even there. One smooth motion, and it was over the fence and into the garden, and then into the trees beyond, vanished, just like that. Grandpa and Uncle Jeremiah, they just reacted. They didn't think, they just acted. Both of them raised their shotguns at the same time and fired. Boom! Boom! The sound was deafening, especially after all that screaming and then sudden silence. The shotguns roared, the recoil kicked hard against their shoulders, and the blasts echoed through the night, bouncing off the trees and back towards us. But the thing didn't even flinch. It didn't stop. It didn't make a sound. It just kept going, over the fence, into the trees, and gone, like we'd shot at a ghost, or something that didn't feel pain. After the gunshots, everything was quiet, except for our breathing, heavy, ragged breaths, and my heart, still pounding like a drum solo. The smell of gunpowder filled the air. Grandma came running out of the house, wrapped in a shawl, her face pale and scared. What was that? What was all that noise? Grandpa and Uncle Jeremiah just stood there, their shotguns still raised, pointing towards the woods. They looked stunned, like they couldn't believe what they'd just seen, or hadn't seen, or shot at and missed. I don't know, Ma, Grandpa said finally, his voice still shaky. I don't know. We stayed outside for a while longer, just staring into the darkness, listening. There was nothing. No more screams, no rustling in the trees, just silence. The normal night sounds of the woods started to come back slowly. Crickets, maybe an owl hooting in the distance. Like nothing had happened, except we all knew something had. We went back inside. Grandma kept asking questions, but Grandpa and Uncle Jeremiah just kept shaking their heads. They wouldn't say exactly what they'd seen, not right away. They just said it was something big, something they couldn't explain. They checked the house, made sure all the doors and windows were locked tight. Then they sat up for the rest of the night with their shotguns, just in case. I couldn't sleep either. I just lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to every little creak of the old house, every rustle of leaves outside the window. Every shadow in the room seemed to move. I was terrified, truly terrified. The next morning, when the sun came up, everything looked different. Normal. Almost disappointingly normal. Like maybe it had all been a bad dream. But it wasn't. We all knew it wasn't. After breakfast, Grandpa and Uncle Jeremiah went out to look around. I went with them. We searched the yard, the garden, the woods, right around the house. We looked for, I don't know, footprints? Anything. The ground was hard, packed dirt, dry October leaves all over the place. We didn't find any footprints. Nothing. It was like the thing hadn't even been there, except at the garden fence, where it had jumped over. There, the top rail was broken, snapped clean through, like something heavy had landed on it or pushed against it with incredible force. And the ground on the other side of the fence, inside the garden, the vegetable patch was a mess. Rows of Grandma's tomatoes and peppers were crushed, plants ripped out of the ground. Big, heavy tracks in the soft soil, but not like animal tracks. More like something had just stomped around, heavy and clumsy. And that's it. That's all we found. No fur, no blood, no anything else. Just the broken fence and the messed up garden. And the feeling that we'd seen something we weren't supposed to see, something unnatural. Word got around Raven's Roost, of course. Grandma and Grandpa, they didn't say much. Just told people they'd heard some noises in the night, maybe a bear or something. But kids in town, they started whispering about the hairy man in the woods. Some story someone's grandma had told them about a creature that lived out in the dark woods, big and scary, that came out at night. Stuff like that. Raven's Roost was full of old stories and legends. But this felt different. This felt real. For me, Raven's Roost changed after that night. It wasn't peaceful anymore, it wasn't quiet. Every shadow seemed darker, every rustle in the leaves sounded like footsteps. Every night I'd lie in bed, listening, waiting, afraid of hearing those screams again, afraid of seeing that thing again. I never saw it again, not in Raven's Roost, not anywhere. But I never forgot it. The size of it, the way it moved, the screams, and those eyes, glowing in the dark. I still don't know what it was, and I probably never will. Grandpa and Uncle Jeremiah, they never talked about it much after that. Just something we saw in the woods, something we couldn't explain, but I know what I saw. We all saw it. And it wasn't a bear, or a mountain lion, or anything natural. Sometimes, late at night, when it's really dark and quiet, I think about Raven's Roost, and I remember that night, and I still get chills, just thinking about it. That feeling, that primal fear, that knowing that something was out there, something big and unknown, walking in the dark. It's a feeling that just stays with you, and you can't shake it off, no matter how much time passes. And sometimes when I'm alone, in the quiet, I swear I can almost hear those screams again, echoing in the darkness. And I wonder, is it still out there, still walking in the woods, waiting for the dark? I honestly have no idea. And that's probably the scariest part of all. Story 8. Ohio, of all places. You think of Ohio, you think cornfields, maybe a bit boring, right? Peaceful. I never expected anything strange to happen there, let alone something that still gives me the creeps thinking about it. Me and Sophia, my wife, we were driving together that run. She likes to ride along sometimes, helps keep me awake. Good company, you know. It was July, hot as hell, even at night. The air was thick, sticky, the kind that makes your shirt cling to your back the second you step outside. We were on State Route 35, somewhere around Buckeye County. I was heading east, just trying to make good time to the next drop. It was late, pushing towards twilight, that sort of in-between time where everything starts to get a little hazy and the shadows get long. Sun had gone down, but it wasn't fully dark yet. Sophia was dozing in the passenger seat, head leaned back, quiet. I had the windows down, trying to get any kind of breeze, even if it was just hot, humid air blowing in my face. The road was pretty empty. Typical back roads of Ohio, 2 lanes, stretches of trees, then fields opening up, little towns every now and then, but mostly just quiet. We'd been driving through farmland for a while, fields of corn mostly, all tall and green, looking almost black against the darkening sky. And then we passed this patch of woods, or what looked like the edge of a bigger forest. There was a sign for Cooper's Creek Wildlife Reserve just before, one of those brown park signs. I remember thinking it looked like a pretty isolated place, the kind of spot where you could easily get lost if you weren't careful. It was right after we passed that sign that I saw it, something at the edge of the road. At first, I thought it was maybe a deer. You see deer all the time, especially in places like this. But this was different. It wasn't moving like a deer, it wasn't shaped like a deer, it was bigger, much bigger. There was this break in the trees where a field opened up again, on the right side of the road. And at the edge of that field, near a lone tree that stood kind of away from the tree line, this thing was there, crouched down like it was about to, I don't know, spring or just get up. It was hard to make out clearly in the fading light and the shadows from the trees, but it was dark. Darker than the shadows, if that makes any sense. Just a solid, dense darkness against the dusk. I remember my first thought wasn't even fear, it was just confusion. Like my brain couldn't quite process what I was seeing. It looked massive, way bigger than any deer I'd ever seen, way bigger than any bear even. And the shape wasn't right. It was bulky, but I don't know how to describe it exactly. Heavy, like it had real weight to it, even just sitting there. I started to slow down instinctively. Something in my gut just told me to slow down. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my eyes glued to this thing. Sophia stirred beside me. "Everything okay?" she mumbled, still half asleep. "Just look," I said, my voice a little strained without meaning to. I pointed towards the field, trying not to take my eyes off of it. Sophia straightened up and looked. She blinked a few times, like she was still waking up, and then she saw it. I heard her sharp intake of breath beside me. "What? What is that?" she whispered, her voice suddenly wide awake and full of concern. I didn't answer because I didn't know. I honestly didn't have a single clue what we were looking at. As we got closer, I could see more detail, or maybe not detail, but just more of its outline. It was definitely crouching, knees bent, arms, something like arms, reaching towards the ground in front of it. The light was bad, but it seemed hairy, covered in something dark and shaggy, and huge, truly huge, like the size of a small car, maybe bigger if it stood up. We were almost right beside it now. I could see the texture of the ground around it, the tall grass of the field, the darker soil closer to the tree, and then this dark shape crouched low to the ground, just a few yards from the edge of the road. It was so close, I could almost reach out and touch it if I'd been crazy enough to stop and get out, and that's when I realized what it looked like it was about to do. It was facing the road. It was positioned like it was about to cross, like it was going to get up and just walk right out onto the highway, right in front of my truck. My foot slammed on the brake pedal without me even thinking about it. The air brakes hissed loud. The truck shuddered and slowed down fast. Sophia gasped again, grabbing onto the dashboard with both hands. We lurched forward in our seats, seatbelts digging in. I brought the truck to a complete stop, right there on the side of Route 35, maybe 20, 30 feet from this thing. We were both staring now, frozen. The engine of the truck idled, loud in the sudden quiet of the night, the only sound besides our breathing and maybe the chirping of crickets in the field. For a moment, everything just stopped. The world seemed to hold its breath, and then it moved, slowly at first. It shifted its weight. I could see the dark mass move, the shadows around it shifting as it adjusted. It was starting to get up. My heart hammered against my ribs. I felt cold sweat break out on my forehead, even in the humid night air. I didn't know what it was, but everything in me screamed danger. It started to rise, slowly, deliberately. I watched, completely paralyzed with a mix of fear and disbelief. As it straightened up, it got taller and taller, and taller. It went from being crouched low to looming upwards, this immense dark shape growing against the twilight sky. It was blocking out the last bits of light from the horizon. I still couldn't make out any clear features. No face, no eyes that I could see, just this massive, shadowy form. But there was a sense of presence, an overwhelming, almost oppressive feeling of something ancient, powerful, and utterly unknown being right there, just a stone's throw away from us. It got to its full height, whatever that height was. It must have been, I don't know, 8, maybe 10 feet tall. It's hard to judge in that kind of light, in that kind of shock. But it was huge, gigantic, way too big to be any kind of animal I'd ever heard of, let alone in Ohio. And then it just vanished. 1 second it was there, this towering dark shape right at the edge of the field, dominating the landscape. The next, nothing, just the empty field, the lone tree, the tree line of the Coopers Creek Wildlife Reserve in the background, and the deepening twilight sky. It was like it had never been there at all. Just gone. Poof. Like a light switched off. I blinked, hard, several times. Sophia beside me let out a shaky breath. Did you see that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Yeah," I said, my own voice sounding hoarse and weak. "Yeah, I saw it." We just sat there in silence for what felt like a long time, but was probably only a minute or two, staring at the empty field, the spot where it had been just seconds before. Looking for, I don't know what we were looking for. Some kind of trace, some sign that we hadn't just imagined the whole thing. But there was nothing. Just grass and trees and shadows. The field was still, silent, completely normal. Except nothing felt normal anymore. My heart was still pounding. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel. Sophia was pale, her eyes wide and scared. The air felt different, charged somehow. The quiet of the countryside suddenly felt menacing. "What was that?" Sophia asked again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Matteo, what in God's name was that?" I shook my head. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I have absolutely no idea." And that was the truth. I'd driven thousands upon thousands of miles across this country, seen all kinds of wildlife, all sorts of things along the roads, but I had never, ever seen anything remotely like that. Never even heard of anything like that. We sat there for a few more moments, both of us just staring, trying to process what we'd just witnessed. Then, slowly, hesitantly, I put the truck back in gear. I didn't want to stay there any longer. I just wanted to get away from that place, from that field, from whatever the hell we had just seen. I pulled back onto Route 35 and started driving again, faster this time. Sophia stayed quiet for a long while, just looking out the window at the passing trees. I could feel her tension beside me, the way she was holding herself stiffly in her seat. I was tense too. My muscles were tight, my senses on high alert. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound made me jump. Finally, after a few miles, Sophia spoke again. "You really saw it too, right?" she said, turning to look at me, her eyes searching mine. I wasn't imagining things. It wasn't just the light playing tricks. "No," I said firmly. "You saw it. I saw it. We both saw it. It was real." Saying it out loud didn't make it any less unbelievable, but it was important to acknowledge it, to each other, to ourselves. We talked about it a little more as we drove. We tried to make sense of it, to rationalize it. Maybe it was a bear. But bears don't get that tall and they don't move like that. Maybe it was a person in some kind of costume, but a costume that massive. And out in the middle of nowhere, at twilight near a wildlife reserve. It didn't make any sense. None of it did. The more we talked, the less we understood. And the more we didn't understand, the more unsettling it became. It was like we had glimpsed something that wasn't supposed to be there, something that didn't belong in our reality. We didn't sleep well that night. Even after we stopped at a truck stop a few hours later and tried to get some rest in the cab, I kept seeing it in my mind. That dark, hulking shape rising up against the fading light, and then just gone. Every time I closed my eyes, it was there. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine again and again. Sophia was restless too, tossing and turning beside me. I knew she was seeing it in her mind as well. We never drove that route again, not intentionally. We made sure to avoid State Route 35 in Ohio on any future runs. It's like that one stretch of road, that specific area near Cooper's Creek Wildlife Reserve, became tainted, somehow, marked. I didn't want to go back there, ever. And to this day, I have no idea what we saw that night, no logical explanation. I've looked online, searched for stories, for anything that might sound remotely similar. Bigfoot, maybe? But Bigfoot is usually described as hairy, more ape-like. This was different, darker, more primal somehow. And the feeling it left us with wasn't just fear, it was something else, something deeper, a sense of unease that lingered for weeks, maybe months afterward. I've driven all over, seen a lot of strange and beautiful places, but nothing has ever shaken me like that night in Ohio. Sometimes, late at night when I'm out on the road, alone in the dark, miles from anywhere, I still think about it. I still see that dark shape rising up out of the field. And I wonder, what was it? And is it still out there? Out there in the woods, by the side of some lonely road, waiting in the shadows. It's a thought that sticks with you, you know? A cold, creeping feeling that reminds you that there are things in this world that we just don't understand. Things that might be closer than we think, just at the edge of our vision, waiting for the twilight to fall. And that, honestly, is more terrifying than anything I could ever imagine. Story 9. But then things started to change. It wasn't overnight, more like a slow creep. Season after season, the numbers were down, way down. I figured maybe overhunting or disease, normal stuff. But it felt different. There was this emptiness in the woods, like they were hollowed out, if that makes sense. Used to be, even on a slow night, you'd hear rustling, see signs, hear critters moving around. Then it just went quiet, too quiet. Fall of 2013, that was the year things went proper weird. Real late October, that kind of cold that bites right through you, even bundled up. Me and Beth, my wife, we still went out, trying to make something of the season. Had old Blue with us, my best hound dog, damn good tracker, never spooked by anything. We pulled up to our usual spot by Miller's farm, edge of Coal Creek Hollow. Corn was harvested already, just stubble and stalks sticking up, fields stretching out to the tree line, perfect for coons coming out of the woods to feed in the leftovers. But Blue, he wouldn't get out of the truck. Normally he's bouncing off the walls, whining, tail thumping, practically dragging me out to get going. That night he just sat there in his kennel in the back, wouldn't even make eye contact. I opened the tailgate, called him, whistled. Nothing. Just sat there, low growl rumbling in his chest. Now, Blue was a seasoned dog. He'd been through thick and thin with me. Never seen him act like that. And then I smelled it. This stink. Hard to describe. Kinda like wet dog, but turned rotten, mixed with something else, something sickly sweet and wrong. Made my stomach churn. Beth wrinkled her nose from the passenger seat, said, "Jesus, Danny, what's that smell?" I told her I didn't know, but it was awful. Even out in the open, the smell was hanging heavy in the air. Still, I figured Blue was just having an off night. Dogs do that sometimes. Maybe the smell was throwing him off. I coaxed him out, clipped on his leash, but he was stiff as a board, tail tucked, ears flattened. Dragging his feet, wouldn't pull ahead like he usually does, sniffing everything in sight. He was practically glued to my leg. We walked towards the woods, the cornfield on our right, empty fields on the left. It was silent, dead silent. Not even crickets chirping, no owls hooting, nothing. Just the crunch of our boots on the dry ground and Blue's uneasy panting. The smell got stronger as we got closer to the woods, making my head spin a little. We walked the edge of the field for maybe half a mile, Blue whining the whole time, but no coon tracks, no fresh sign of anything, nothing moving. It was just wrong. I started feeling uneasy myself. That empty, watched feeling you get sometimes in the woods, but amplified, turned up to 11, like something was watching from the dark. Something big and nasty, and it didn't like us being there. Then we heard it. Footsteps. Not Blue, not us. Something else, moving in the cornfield beside us. Not running, just walking. Heavy steps, snapping stalks, rustling the dry leaves, like someone big stomping through the corn. I froze, heart hammering in my chest. Beth grabbed my arm, her knuckles white. "Danny, what's that?" she whispered, voice shaking. I told her to be quiet, held up my hand. We stood there listening. The steps kept pace with us as we walked, hidden in the rows of corn. Heavy, deliberate steps, like whatever it was just pacing us, watching. I shined my flashlight into the corn, beam cutting through the rows. Nothing, just stalks and stubble, but the steps were still there, just on the edge of the light, keeping pace. I stopped walking, and the steps stopped too. Dead silence again, except for our breathing and Blue whimpering beside me. Beth was breathing hard, said, "Danny, let's just go. This place is freaking me out." Honestly, I was thinking the same thing. Something was definitely off. This wasn't normal wood sounds or even animals. This felt intentional, malicious even. We turned back towards the truck, walking faster now, almost jogging. And the steps started again too, matching our pace in the cornfield, picking up speed, getting louder. It felt like it was getting closer to the edge of the field, closer to us. I swung the flashlight back towards the cornfield, sweeping the beam wildly. Still nothing, just the empty rows of stalks. But the footsteps were right there, just beyond the light, heavy and deliberate. We practically ran the last stretch to the truck, scrambling over the ditch, fumbling with the tailgate to get Blue back in his kennel. He jumped in as soon as I opened it, scrambling to the back, curling up into a tight ball, trembling. I slammed the tailgate, jumped in the driver's seat, Beth slammed her door shut, and I started the truck, engine roaring to life. We peeled out of there, tires spitting gravel, not looking back. Didn't stop driving until we were miles away, back on the main road, streetlights and houses all around. Beth was white as a sheet, just staring straight ahead. I was shaking, hands tight on the steering wheel, heart still pounding like crazy. What was that, Danny? She finally asked, voice barely a whisper. I didn't have an answer. I'd hunted these woods my whole life, never experienced anything like it. I don't know, I said. Something bad. Something real bad. We didn't talk much the rest of the way home. The smell was still in my truck, faint but there, that rotten, sickly smell. It clung to us, to our clothes. I felt dirty, like I'd been touched by something. Unclean. The next morning, I still couldn't shake the feeling, that heavy, uneasy feeling in my gut, and the smell was still there, lingering in the air around my truck, even after airing it out. I had to know what it was. I told Beth I was going back to check it out in daylight. She begged me not to, said it was too dangerous, whatever it was. But I had to see, had to understand. I grabbed my shotgun, just in case, told myself it was for coyotes or something, but deep down, I knew it was for whatever the hell was in that cornfield. Drove back out to Coal Creek Hollow in the bright sunlight, figuring it would be different, less scary in the day. Pulled up to the same spot by Miller's farm. The morning air was cold and crisp, sun shining, looked normal enough, but the moment I stepped out of the truck, that smell hit me again, even stronger now, gaggingly strong. It was definitely coming from the woods, and it was mixed with another smell now, something sharp and acrid like ammonia, or something worse. I hesitated, shotgun heavy in my hands. Daylight or not, something felt deeply wrong. But I pushed through it, walked towards the woods again, following the edge of the cornfield, and then I saw it. The woods themselves looked wrong. Twisted, broken branches hanging down like something big and clumsy had just plowed through them. Some trees were snapped clean in half, young saplings just uprooted and tossed aside, like a tornado had hit, but only in a small strip of woods. And the smell was overpowering now, thick and suffocating. I could taste it in the back of my throat. I went closer, shotgun raised, heart pounding, and then I saw the ground. It was churned up, torn apart, like something had been digging or wrestling. Deep gouges in the earth, leaves and dirt scattered everywhere. And in the middle of it, a circular patch of cornfield, maybe 20 feet across, flattened, completely flattened, like something huge had laid down in the middle of it. The stalks were crushed, broken, bent to the ground, forming a perfect circle in the middle of the field. I walked closer to the flattened circle, cautious, shotgun held tight, and I saw stuff, corn cobs. Tons of them, stripped clean, kernels gone, just the bare cobs, piled up in heaps inside the circle. And bones, small bones, scattered around the edges of the flattened circle, mixed in with the cobs. Tiny bones, like from squirrels, rabbits. Too small to be anything bigger, but there were so many of them, and the smell. It was coming from this circle, from the corn cobs and bones. Then I looked closer, at the edge of the cornfield, where it met the woods, and I saw it. A path. Not a game trail, not a deer path. Something wider, something unnatural. Like something had pushed through the thickest part of the rose bushes, forcing a path where no path should be. Rose bushes are vicious things. Thorns like needles, grows in dense thickets. No animal would bother trying to go through that. But this path went right through the heart of it, tearing it apart, snapping branches, leaving a clear opening into the deepest, darkest part of the woods. The path led into the shadows, disappearing into the trees. I stared at it, frozen, shotgun still raised. And then I felt it again, that feeling of being watched, stronger now, closer, like something was just beyond the trees, hidden in the shadows, watching me, waiting. And that's when the stones started falling. Not big rocks, just stones, gravel-sized, small and sharp. The first one hit the ground a few feet in front of me, bounced off the dirt with a sharp crack. I jumped back, heart leaping into my throat, eyes wide, scanning the woods. Nothing, just shadows and trees. Then another one hit, closer this time, whizzed past my ear, stinging my cheek. I ducked, looking around wildly, trying to see where they were coming from. Nothing. Still nothing moving in the woods, just the eerie silence. Except now, the silence was broken by the thwack, thwack of the stones hitting the ground around me, getting closer each time. Another one hit my arm, hard enough to make me yelp. It felt like someone was throwing them, aiming for me, but I couldn't see anyone. Nothing moved in the woods, no sign of anything human or animal. That was it. I snapped. Pure, raw panic flooded me. I didn't care about the smell, the bones, the flattened circle, the footsteps, none of it. All I knew was something was throwing stones at me from those woods, and I was done. I turned and ran, full sprint, back towards the truck, stones still pelting the ground behind me, hissing through the air. I scrambled into the driver's seat, fumbled with the keys, hands shaking so bad I could barely get them in the ignition. Engine roared to life, and I slammed it into gear, peeling out of there, tires throwing dirt and gravel again. I didn't stop driving until I was home, locked inside my house, curtains drawn, shotgun propped up against the wall beside the door. Beth was frantic, asked me what happened, what I saw. I couldn't even explain it right, just kept saying stones, woods, something bad. I never went back to Coal Creek Hollow, never hunted there again. Blue never went back in my truck for weeks after that, wouldn't even go near it. The smell lingered for days, inside the truck, in our clothes, in my head. To this day, I don't know what it was. Animal? Human? Something else? I've heard stories, whispers around town, old folks talking about things in those woods, things that aren't supposed to be there, things that don't like being disturbed. I used to laugh it off, call it old wives' tales. Now I don't know what to believe. All I know is something drove the game out of Coal Creek Hollow, something that smelled like death and threw stones in broad daylight and left piles of stripped corn cobs and bones in a flattened circle in the cornfield. Something that left a path through a wall of rose bushes and watched from the shadows with heavy, silent footsteps, and I'm never going back to find out what it was. Some things are best left alone. Some questions are better left unanswered, and some places are just cursed. Coal Creek Hollow. That's cursed ground, I swear it. And whatever is there, it's still there, waiting in the shadows, listening for footsteps in the corn. Story 10. Okay, so this is something I haven't really talked about much outside of, close family because it sounds crazy. And honestly, sometimes I still think I dreamt it, but it didn't feel like a dream, not even close. It was November 2015. Harmony Creek is supposed to be this peaceful place, right? That's why I moved out here in the first place years ago. Quiet, everyone knows everyone, leaves you alone, perfect for raising kids and then grandkids. And it was, for a long time. Until it wasn't. My grandson Zachary, he was, maybe 6? Little guy, big imagination, sure, but not like this. It was a Tuesday night, I remember, because Tuesdays were always pizza night. He was with me, just me and him, watching cartoons in the living room. I was in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner. Nothing out of the ordinary. Then I hear this scream. Not just a normal kid scream like he scraped his knee or something. This was different, piercing, full of real terror. I ran in there, heart pounding, expecting to find him fallen off the couch or something worse. He was just standing there, frozen stiff, pointing at the big window in the living room that looks out onto the front yard. Tears streaming down his face white as a sheet. He was shaking, like he was freezing, but the house was warm. "Zachary, what is it? What happened?" I asked, kneeling down, trying to get him to look at me. He wouldn't. He just kept pointing at the window, sobbing, The monster. Grandma, the monster. Monster? I looked around, expecting to see a bug, maybe a spider, something a kid would get freaked out by. Nothing. The window was just the window. Nighttime outside, dark, a few trees swaying a little in the breeze. Honey, there's nothing there. Was it a bad dream? Did you just wake up? I tried to reason with him, thinking he'd maybe drifted off during cartoons and had a nightmare. He shook his head violently. No, no dream. It was right there. Big, big and black. At the window. It was looking at me, Grandma. Looking at me with eyes. He couldn't calm down. I tried to soothe him, told him it was just his imagination. Kids get scared sometimes, all that stuff you say. But he was adamant. Refused to go near the living room window again. Wouldn't even sit on the couch anymore. He clung to me the rest of the evening, wouldn't let go. Finally, he fell asleep in my bed, still clutching my hand like his life depended on it. I didn't see anything, didn't hear anything unusual. Figured it was just a kid being a kid. But his fear was real. You could feel it. And it stuck with me that night. Made me a little uneasy, even though I told myself it was nothing. Then, a few nights later, it was getting colder, proper November cold. Needed to bring in more firewood. I have a wood-burning stove in the den, keeps the place nice and cozy. So, I went outside to the woodpile, flashlight in hand. It was windy, branches rattling, leaves swirling around my feet. The kind of night where everything creaks and groans. I was stacking logs, making a pretty decent pile in my arms, when I heard it. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. A growl, but deep, gut-wrenching, like something big, animalistic, but wrong somehow. Not like a dog, not like a bear. Lower, rougher, more primal. It cut through the wind and the rustling leaves like a knife. My blood ran cold instantly. I froze, logs slipping from my arms, crashing onto the ground with a loud clatter that seemed deafening in the sudden silence that followed. Silence except for my own heart pounding in my ears. I slowly raised my flashlight, sweeping it around the yard. Nothing, just the trees, the darkness stretching out beyond the edge of the light. Then, just as I was starting to think maybe it was my imagination, or maybe just a big dog further away than I realized, I saw movement. Over by the tree line, near the edge of the woods. Something dark, massive. It was hard to make out details in the darkness, and it moved quickly, lurching, almost like it was stumbling. It was big, though, I could tell that much, even just a glimpse. Bigger than any deer, bigger than a bear. And then it was gone, swallowed up by the trees. I stood there, flashlight shaking in my hand, listening, holding my breath. The wind seemed to have died down. Everything was still again. Too still. And then I heard it again. A different sound this time. More a snort or a guttural, almost cough, like something struggling to breathe. It came from the direction where I'd seen the dark shape disappear. Then silence again. I didn't wait around. I dropped the flashlight, scattering wood everywhere, and ran back to the house as fast as my legs would carry me. Fumbled with the keys, got the door open, slammed it shut behind me, and locked it, deadbolt and all. I was panting, heart racing like it was going to jump out of my chest. I peered out the window, into the darkness, straining to see anything. Nothing, just shadows and trees moving in the wind, or what little wind there was left. That night, I barely slept. Every little noise outside made me jump. Branches brushing against the house, the wind whistling around the eaves, even just the creaks and groans of the old house settling. Everything sounded amplified, menacing. I kept thinking about that growl, that dark shape, Zachary's monster. Could it be connected? Was I just being paranoid? Probably. Probably just an animal. A big dog, maybe a coyote sounding weird in the wind. That's what I told myself. Had to. Thanksgiving night was when things went from unsettling to genuinely terrifying. I was working a late shift at the diner, extra busy because of the holiday. Jared, who was renting the spare room from me at the time, was home. The grandkids had all gone home with their parents after dinner earlier in the day. Just Jared and me. Well, just Jared at the house. I was busy at the counter taking orders when my phone buzzed in my apron pocket. A security alert. I'd installed cameras around the house a few months before, just for peace of mind. Never really thought I'd need them for anything serious, but they made me feel a bit safer. I pulled out my phone, glanced at the notification. Motion detected at the front window. Probably just a raccoon or a deer wandering through the yard. Still, I tapped on the app, opened up the live feed for the front camera, and my stomach dropped, fell right through the floor. It wasn't a raccoon, it wasn't a deer. Standing right outside my front window, pressed up close, peering in, was something. Something massive. Dark, like the shadows had taken shape. I couldn't make out details of its body. It was mostly just a hulking silhouette against the darkness. But what I could see, what made my blood run ice cold, were the eyes. 2 eyes, burning red, glowing, staring right into the camera. They were high up, way higher than any person, any normal animal I could think of. At least 8 feet off the ground, maybe more. Just those 2 red points of light, burning in the dark, fixed on the camera, fixed on me, through the screen of my phone, miles away. My breath hitched in my throat. I couldn't scream, couldn't move. Just stared at the screen, heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. Those eyes, they were intelligent, watching, calculating, not like animal eyes. Something else, something sinister. Finally, I managed to croak out Jared's name. Found his number in my contacts, fingers trembling so badly I almost dropped my phone. It rang and rang. Felt like forever. He finally answered, sounding groggy, probably been asleep on the couch. Jared, wake up. Listen to me. There's something outside the house. Right now, looking in the front window. I'm seeing it on the security camera. Go look, right now. I was practically shouting into the phone, trying to keep my voice from cracking completely. He sounded confused, still half asleep, but I could tell he heard the panic in my voice. Bonnie, what are you talking about? What's outside? Just go look, Jared. Please, the front window, something big. Red eyes, just be careful. And I hung up, still staring at the phone screen, at those awful red eyes. They hadn't moved. They were just there, watching. Minutes stretched out, felt like hours. I kept refreshing the camera feed, praying Jared would do something, see something. Then the feed went black. Signal lost. No signal. My heart leaped into my throat. Did it break the camera? Did it get him? I tried calling Jared back, went straight to voicemail, called again, voicemail. Panic surged, overwhelming me. I told my boss I had to leave, emergency at home, didn't explain anything. Just grabbed my coat, keys, and bolted out of there, leaving her staring after me with a puzzled look. The drive home was the longest, most terrifying drive of my life. Every shadow along the road looked like it was moving. Every rustle of leaves sounded like footsteps. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. I kept hitting the gas, speeding, wanting to get home, but terrified of what I might find when I got there. Pulled into the driveway, tires spitting gravel. The house was dark except for the porch light I always leave on. Everything seemed normal, too normal, silent, still, ominous. I turned off the engine, heart hammering in my chest, listened. Nothing. No growls, no snorts, no sounds at all, except the crickets chirping, oblivious to the terror I was feeling. Slowly, cautiously, I got out of the car, fumbling for my keys again. Every shadow seemed to move. Every tree looked like it was hiding something. I walked up to the front door, key in hand, and then I saw it. The camera. The security camera right above the front door. It was twisted downwards, facing the ground, wires dangling loose, ripped right off the wall. My hand froze on the doorknob. It was real. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't my imagination. Something had been here. Something had ripped the camera off the wall. Something with red eyes. I unlocked the door, pushed it open slowly and called out, "Jared? Jared, are you here?" My voice trembled, echoed in the silence of the house. No answer, just silence. Heavy, thick silence. I stepped inside, flicked on the light switch. The living room was empty. Just the furniture, the TV, the window. The window where it had been looking in. And then I saw Jared. He was in the den, slumped in his armchair, fast asleep, snoring softly. Relief washed over me in a dizzying wave. He was okay. He was just asleep. Probably didn't hear the phone, or maybe he checked, didn't see anything, and figured I was overreacting. "Jared!" I said, louder this time, shaking his shoulder. He stirred, blinked sleepily, looked up at me, confused. "Bonnie? What are you doing home? Is everything okay?" "Okay? Jared, did you see anything outside? On the front porch? Anything at the window?" I asked, my voice still shaking. He rubbed his eyes, yawned. "Outside? No. Why? What's wrong? You sounded crazy on the phone." But I saw it, Jared. On the camera. Something huge, dark, with red eyes. It was right outside the front window. Did you check? Did you even look?" He frowned, looked around, still groggy. Yeah, I looked after you called. Went to the front door, looked out. Nothing there, just darkness. Wind blowing the trees around. Thought you were seeing things. Probably just a deer or something messing with your camera. Looked outside for like 5 minutes, didn't see a thing. Came back in, figured you were worked up over nothing." He shrugged, still yawning. "Guess I fell back asleep." He hadn't seen anything. He'd looked, but it was gone by then. And he didn't think to check the camera. Didn't think to notice it was ripped off the wall. I didn't even bother explaining about the camera then. I was just drained, exhausted, and still terrified. Even though he was here, even though the house was quiet, the relief was quickly replaced by a bone-deep chill. He hadn't seen it, but I had. I knew what I'd seen. After that, things got weirder. Subtle things, mostly. My old dog, Buster, a golden retriever, always loved being outside at night. Used to bark at every noise, chase after squirrels, the usual dog stuff. Suddenly, he refused to go out after dark. Wouldn't even step foot outside the back door if it was nighttime. Whined and scratched at the door to come back in the second you let him out. He was terrified of something out there in the dark. Dogs know things. They sense things we can't. That scared me even more. Then there was the smell. Started a few weeks later. This awful, putrid stench, like something rotting. But it would just appear suddenly, out of nowhere, usually at night, hanging around the house. Then it would be gone again. No obvious source, nothing dead or decaying that I could find anywhere around the property. And it only happened on still nights. No wind to carry the smell in. Just there. Stinking up the air, then vanishing as mysteriously as it appeared. Jared noticed it too. Commented on it a couple of times, but we could never figure out what it was. And the fruit. I have peach trees and apricot trees in the backyard, always get a good harvest in the summer. But in the winter, there's nothing, right? Except I started noticing peaches and apricots disappearing from the trees. Ripe ones, the ones that had been left over from the fall, still hanging on, shriveled up a bit. They just started vanishing, one by one. Night after night, even though it was November, December, too cold for animals to be actively foraging for fruit like that, and even if they were, they'd strip the whole tree, not just pick off individual pieces selectively, night after night. It made no sense, but the worst part, the part that truly terrified me, was knowing my grandkids played in that backyard. They loved running around under the trees, building forts in the woods behind the house. Unaware, completely innocent, and I couldn't shake the image of those red eyes, the hulking shadow lurking in the darkness, watching. What if it was watching them? What if it was waiting? I never saw it again after that Thanksgiving night. No more red eyes at the window, no more growls, no more shapes in the dark, but the fear never really left. It's still here, even now. I double-check the locks every night. I don't go out after dark unless I absolutely have to. And I can't shake the feeling, the certainty that something was out there. Something not natural. Something hungry. Watching. Harmony Creek isn't so peaceful anymore. Not for me. And sometimes, when I'm sitting in the dark late at night, I swear I can still smell that awful stench on the wind. And I remember those red eyes, burning in the darkness, staring right through me. And I know, deep down, it's still out there, somewhere in the shadows, waiting, and I have no idea what it was, or what it wanted. And that's the part that keeps me up at night. The not knowing, the chilling uncertainty. It just stopped, just vanished, and left me here wondering, what the hell was that thing? Story 11. It's still so vivid in my head even after all these years. It's like some kind of messed up home movie that plays whenever I let my mind wander in the quiet. And I hate the quiet now, by the way. Always got to have the TV on, or music, something to fill the space. It all started when I was a kid living in Clear Fork, real small town, you know. Everyone knows everyone else's business. Back then, life was slower, quieter, especially in the fall. Crisp air, leaves turning all shades of red and gold. It was pretty, I guess, but there was always this undertone, a feeling like something was just beneath the surface, something you couldn't quite see but you knew was there. I can't explain it better than that, just a feeling. My childhood home, it was a regular 2-story house, nothing special. My room was upstairs, facing the backyard and the church next door. We had this beagle named Brownie, sweetest dog you could imagine, but man, when he barked like his life depended on it. He slept in the yard in his doghouse. He was an outside dog back then, that's just how it was. One night, I must have been 7, maybe 8 years old, I woke up because Brownie was going nuts. Not just a regular bark, but this frantic, high-pitched yelping that was different, scared. It pulled me right out of sleep. I remember my heart was already thumping hard before I even opened my eyes. I was instantly uneasy. I tiptoed to the window and peeked out. Moon was full or close to it, casting everything in this silvery, spooky light. Our backyard was decent size. Then there was a line of trees separating our yard from the church property. The church itself was set back a bit, maybe 100 feet from our property line. At first I didn't see anything unusual, just the yard, the doghouse, the shadows from the trees swaying in the breeze. But Brownie was still going crazy, barking and growling, facing away from the house, towards the trees and the church. Then I saw it. It was down by the trees, just inside our yard. It was big and dark, and at first I couldn't really make out what it was because of the shadows. It was like a darker patch of darkness, moving slowly. My stomach dropped. We had a dim kitchen light that my parents always left on all night, some kind of nightlight thing, I guess. That faint yellow glow reached out into the backyard enough to make things just barely visible in the moonlight. As this thing moved, it stepped into that little bit of light, and I saw it clearly enough to wish I hadn't. It was tall, really tall, standing upright, and it was brown, dark brown, furry brown. It wasn't an animal, not like any animal I'd ever seen, even in pictures. It was like a person, but not. It was standing on 2 legs, walking on 2 legs, but its body was all wrong. It was covered in this thick, shaggy brown fur, like no clothes, just hair. That's exactly how my kid brain registered it. No clothes, just brown hair. It was walking slowly, deliberately, past Brownie's doghouse. Brownie was still losing his mind, barking and pulling at his chain. Thank God he was chained, because who knows what would have happened if he wasn't. The thing didn't even seem to notice him. It just kept walking. It was headed towards the church, not towards the church building itself, but towards the property behind the church, the woods that went on forever back there. As it walked, it passed under this huge old maple tree on the edge of our yard. And that's when I really understood how tall it was. Its head, its dark, shadowed head, brushed against the lowest branches of that maple tree, branches that were way higher than my dad could reach standing on a ladder. It was massive, and the way it moved, it was unsettling, long, loping strides. Its arms, they were long too, dangling down, swinging with each step. It wasn't running, wasn't in a hurry. It was just moving, purposefully. I stood frozen at the window, staring. I couldn't breathe, couldn't scream, couldn't even move. Just watched as this creature walked past our yard, under the big maple tree, and disappeared into the shadows near the church property. After it was gone, Brownie finally started to quiet down, whimpering now, scared. I stood there for what felt like forever, just staring at the empty space where it had been. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. My legs felt like jelly. Eventually I backed away from the window, slowly, quietly. I crawled back into bed and pulled the covers up to my chin, even though it wasn't even cold in my room. I lay there, wide awake, listening to the quiet house, the occasional creak of the old house settling, the now soft whimpering of Brownie outside. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, when the sun came up, everything looked normal. Birds were singing, the leaves were rustling, the backyard was just a backyard. Normal. Like nothing had happened. Like I'd dreamed it. I went downstairs for breakfast, but I didn't say anything to my parents. I was scared they wouldn't believe me, or worse, they'd think I was crazy. Kids see things, right? Imaginary friends, monsters under the bed. I figured they'd just brush it off as a bad dream. And part of me wanted to believe that's all it was, too. Just a really, really real feeling bad dream. But it didn't feel like a dream. It felt real, solid. The image of that tall, brown thing stayed burned in my mind. That wasn't the only weird thing that happened around that time, though. Not long after, maybe a couple months, something else happened at our house that was just wrong. We had this smokehouse in the backyard. Dad built it himself. Small wooden building, meant for smoking meats, obviously. We had hams hanging in there at the time, getting smoked. We were going to have a big family dinner that weekend. One night, we all heard this commotion from the backyard. Loud, crashing noises, like something big was banging around. My mom yelled for everyone to get downstairs, now. My grandma was visiting, my two sisters, me, my mum. We all huddled in the living room, scared. Dad grabbed his shotgun. He kept a shotgun for hunting, mostly. I'd never seen him look so serious. He went outside, gun loaded, flashlight in his other hand. We watched from the living room window, peering out into the darkness. We could hear him yelling, his voice tight with anger and something else, maybe fear. He got to the smokehouse, and he shined the flashlight inside. Then he yelled something we couldn't understand, but it sounded like a curse word. Mom ran out after him, even though he told her to stay inside. They were both out there for a while, flashlights moving around. We were all huddled at the window, whispering, trying to figure out what was going on. Finally, they came back inside. Mom was white as a sheet and Dad was just shaking his head. He locked the door and made sure all the windows were shut tight. He sat down in his armchair, still holding the shotgun across his lap. "What was it? What happened?" Mom asked, her voice trembling. Dad took a deep breath and rubbed his face. "Something broke into the smokehouse," he said. "Smashed the door right off its hinges." "What was it?" Mom asked again. "Did you see anything?" He hesitated. "No," he said slowly. "I didn't see anything." "But you yelled," Mom pressed. I yelled for it to get out," he said. "I told it I'd shoot." "And then?" He just shook his head again. Then it was gone. just like that. Mom and my older sister went to look at the smokehouse the next morning after it was light out. They came back looking even more freaked out. The smokehouse door was splintered, completely destroyed. One of the windows was smashed out, like something had kicked it from the inside. And the hams were gone. All of them. Just vanished. They found muddy footprints all around the smokehouse. Big footprints, too big to be a dog or a raccoon or anything normal. And they weren't human footprints either. They were weirdly shaped, like bigger and wider with long toes or maybe claws. I didn't see them myself. My older sister described them later. Nobody could explain it. The police came and looked around, but they just shrugged and said it was probably some kids messing around, or maybe a bear. But there hadn't been a bear sighting in Clearfork in years, and kids couldn't have broken into the smokehouse like that, and they wouldn't have taken just the hams and nothing else. It didn't make any sense. After that, things just felt different. Around the house, around Clearfork in general, like that feeling I had before, the one of something being just beneath the surface. It got stronger, more menacing. My older sisters started saying they'd seen things too, out in the woods behind our house, or down by the creek. Shadows moving in the trees, things disappearing. They were older, maybe they were just more imaginative, but it still freaked me out to hear them talking about it. We had a neighbor, Mr. Schmidt. He was an older guy, from Austria, I think. He had this thick accent. He was always telling us these weird stories about his home country, stories about monsters and creatures that lived in the mountains. He called them boogers. He would tell us these stories with a straight face, like he actually believed them. Back then we just laughed, thought he was a little crazy. But now I wonder. Now I think maybe he wasn't so crazy after all. Time went on, we grew up, moved away. Clearfork faded into the background, became just a place from my childhood. The weird stuff, it became stories we told at family gatherings. Funny, slightly creepy anecdotes from when we were kids. We'd laugh about the Hamburglar and Mr. Schmidt's boogers. Childhood stuff, you know. Then 2012, summer. I was married to Doug by then, living a few towns over from Clearfork. We liked to go fishing sometimes, just relaxing, getting away from everything. There's this lake near Hammertown, real remote, called Miller's Lake. Not a big lake, more like a large pond, surrounded by woods. Perfect for fishing, quiet, peaceful, or so we thought. It was a summer evening, getting close to dark. We were out on the lake in our little rowboat, using a small electric motor to move around. Fishing was slow, but it was nice just being out there, the water calm, the air still. We were pretty far out from the shore, in the middle of the lake. It was getting darker by the minute, the sun just about to set. The crickets were starting up, that chirping sound that fills the summer evenings. Peaceful, really peaceful. Then it happened. Out of nowhere, the silence was just ripped apart by a sound I've never heard before and hope to never hear again. It was a howl, but not like any wolf howl or coyote howl or dog howl I'd ever heard. It was deeper, more guttural, more animalistic, but also intelligent, if that makes any sense. Like it wasn't just a sound of pain or anger or fear. It was something else, something ancient, something primal. It started low, rumbling, then it built, rising in pitch and volume until it was this deafening roar that echoed across the lake. It was long, drawn out, like it went on forever, and it was loud. So loud it felt like it vibrated in my chest, in my bones. The crickets stopped, just stopped. Everything stopped. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, just this terrifying howl hanging in the air. I froze. Rod in my hand, reel clicking softly in the breeze. I didn't even realize I'd reeled in. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Just listen to that sound, this sound of pure terror. Doug was sitting across from me in the boat. He was pale, his eyes wide. He whispered, barely audible, "What the hell was that?" The howl finally stopped. The silence rushed back in, but it was different now. Heavy, menacing, not peaceful anymore. Just waiting. We stared at each other, both of us completely freaked out. The hair on my arms was standing up, my skin felt cold and clammy. My heart was pounding like a drum solo in my ears. "Let's go," Doug said, his voice still a whisper. "Let's just go." We started reeling in our lines, frantically like our lives depended on it. The little electric motor, it wouldn't start. Just coughed and sputtered. Dead. Of course it was. Figures. "Damn it!" Doug cursed, hitting the motor with his fist. Still nothing, dead as a doornail. "We'll have to row," I said, my voice shaky. We grabbed the oars and started paddling, back towards the boat ramp, back towards the shore. It felt like the longest paddle of my life. Every stroke felt like an eternity. The darkness was closing in around us, the trees on the shore looming like black shapes against the fading sky. Every shadow looked like something moving. Every rustle of leaves sounded like footsteps. We rowed in silence, both of us listening, straining to hear anything else, anything more. But there was just silence. Heavy, oppressive silence. Way worse than the howl somehow. When we finally got close enough to shore for Doug to jump out and pull the boat in, my legs were shaking so bad I could barely stand. He tied the boat to the dock and then said, "Wait here. I'll go get the truck." "No," I said instantly. "Don't leave me here alone." He looked at me and I could see the fear in his eyes too. He knew I was terrified. But the truck was parked way up at the parking area, a bit of a walk through the woods. We couldn't both go, leaving the boat untied. "It'll be faster if I go alone," he said softly. "I'll be right back. Just stay in the boat, okay? Lock yourself in the boat." "There's no door to lock," I said, my voice cracking. "It's a rowboat, Doug." He hesitated, then sighed. Just stay here. And be quiet, okay? I'll be as fast as I can." And then he was gone. He ran off towards the woods, disappearing into the darkness, leaving me alone, in the boat, in the middle of the lake, with whatever had made that sound still out there somewhere. That was the worst part, waiting, alone, in the dark, knowing that sound could come again at any moment. The silence was deafening now. I could hear my own breath, loud in my ears, the water lapping gently against the boat. Every little sound was amplified, distorted by the fear. Every shadow seemed to move, to take shape. I kept expecting to see something in the trees, something watching me, something brown and tall. I huddled down in the boat, trying to make myself as small as possible, trying to breathe quietly, trying not to panic, trying to remember that Doug would be back soon, trying to believe that nothing else would happen. But the fear was just overwhelming, paralyzing. It wasn't just the fear of the sound. It was the fear of the unknown, the fear of what could make a sound like that, what was out there in the woods, in the darkness that we didn't know about. I waited and waited. Every second stretched out, felt like minutes. Every minute felt like an hour. It felt like he'd been gone forever. What if he wasn't coming back? What if whatever made that sound got him? The thoughts raced through my mind, each one more terrifying than the last. I kept scanning the trees, straining my eyes in the darkness, expecting to see something, anything. But there was nothing, just darkness, silence, and the waiting. Then finally I heard it, a sound in the distance, the rumble of a truck engine, getting closer, closer. Oh God, thank you. Headlights flashed through the trees, cutting through the darkness. The truck pulled up to the boat ramp, the engine idling. Doug jumped out, relief flooding his face when he saw me. He didn't say anything, just hurried over, untied the boat, and pulled it onto the trailer. We got in the truck, slammed the doors, locked them, and he started driving. Fast, faster than he usually drives. We didn't talk much on the way home. Just sat in silence, the engine roaring, the headlights cutting through the night. Both of us still shaken, still scared. We never went back to Miller's Lake, not ever. We sold the rowboat eventually. Couldn't stand to even look at it. And I still hear that sound sometimes in my head, especially when it's quiet. That long, drawn-out howl. That sound of something else, something out there, something unknown. I don't know what it was we heard that night. Don't want to know, and I definitely don't want to hear it again, ever. Some things you just can't explain, and some things maybe it's better if you don't. Story 12. We lived in Willow Creek then, a really quiet suburb, the kind of place where nothing much ever happens. Perfect for raising kids, right? We had 3, Sarah, who was 7, Mikey, 5, and little Emily, who was just 3. They were bundles of energy, always needing to be outside, and thank God for the little park at the end of our street. It wasn't much, just a patch of grass, some old swings, a slide that was probably older than me, and a couple of those bouncy spring riders shaped like horses. But for them, it was paradise. Anyway, it was a Tuesday, maybe Wednesday in July, one of those scorcher days where the air feels thick enough to swim in. I'd slathered the kids in sunscreen, packed a bag full of snacks and drinks, and we'd walked over to the park around maybe 2 in the afternoon, hoping the worst of the midday heat was over. The park was empty, which was normal on weekdays. Most people were at work, and the stay-at-home mums usually went in the mornings to beat the heat. The kids immediately scattered like they always did. Sarah went for the swings, pumping her legs hard, trying to see how high she could go. Mikey made a beeline for the slide, and Emily, bless her heart, toddled over to the spring horse, giggling as she tried to climb on. I sat on one of the benches under this big old oak tree, the only real shade in the whole place, watching them, the way you do, making sure they weren't going to kill themselves, enjoying the quiet moment. For a while it was just normal. Kids laughing, the squeak of the swing chains, birds chirping. The kind of afternoon you picture when you think about summer with kids. I was actually starting to relax, which is a rare thing when you have 3 little ones running around. I was even scrolling through my phone, catching up on some messages I'd missed earlier. Then I heard it. It was a snapping sound, like a branch breaking. Not super loud, but definitely distinct from the usual park noises. It came from the woods at the edge of the park. See, our park wasn't completely open. It backed right onto this patch of woods, not a huge forest or anything, just maybe a couple of acres of pretty dense trees and underbrush. Weirdly, everyone kind of avoided those woods. There were paths that went in, but they were always overgrown, and kids were told not to go in there. Just one of those unspoken rules, Anyway, the snap made me look up. I figured it was probably just a deer or something. We sometimes saw deer around there, especially early in the morning or at dusk, harmless enough. But then there was another snap, and this one was closer, and then rustling in the leaves, definitely not deer-like rustling. It sounded heavier, like something big was moving around in there. A weird feeling started to creep in. Not quite fear, not at first, just unease. Like that feeling you get when you think you're being watched. I stopped looking at my phone and just focused on the woods. The kids were still playing, oblivious, thank God. I didn't want to scare them. I stood up slowly and walked a few steps towards the edge of the grass, towards where the woods started. I strained my ears, listening. The rustling stopped. Everything went silent, except for the kids playing and the cicadas buzzing, which suddenly seemed really loud in the silence. And then I saw it. Through the trees, it was like a shadow at first, something dark and tall standing just inside the tree line. I squinted, trying to make out what it was. My mind was racing, trying to find a logical explanation. Was it a person? But who would be standing in the woods like that, and why was it so dark? Then it moved a little, just shifted its weight, and a branch moved aside, and I saw it clearer. And I just froze, completely, utterly frozen. It was tall, taller than any person I'd ever seen, maybe 7 or 8 feet, easy. And it was covered in fur, dark fur, matted looking like an animal's fur, but wrong, completely wrong. It was standing upright like a person, but its proportions were all off. Its arms were too long, hanging down past its knees. Its shoulders were huge, hunched slightly, and its neck, there wasn't really a neck, just its head, sitting right on top of these massive shoulders. But the worst part, the part that made my blood run cold, was its face. I couldn't see it clearly at first because of the shadows and the leaves, but as it turned its head slightly, I got a glimpse. It had eyes, big eyes, dark and intelligent, like human eyes, but not. They were set deep under a heavy brow ridge, and they were just watching, staring right at my kids. Terror, pure ice-cold terror slammed into me. It wasn't a deer, it wasn't a bear, it wasn't anything I could even begin to process. My mind was screaming, but my body was just locked. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe properly. The creature just stood there at the edge of the woods, half hidden in the shadows, watching my kids. And I watched it. We just stared at each other across the little patch of grass, me and whatever the hell it was. It didn't make a sound. It didn't move, except for that slight shifting, that barely perceptible movement. And then, slowly, it opened its mouth. Not in a roar, not in a snarl, just opened it, and I could see teeth. Not sharp, pointy fangs like you'd expect from a wild animal. These were flatter, almost human-like, but bigger and kind of yellowed. And they weren't bared in aggression. It was more like curiosity, like it was examining something, like it was tasting the air. Or listening. Then I realized what it was listening to. My kids, their laughter. Sarah was shrieking with delight on the swing. Mikey was yelling as he went down the slide. Emily was babbling to the spring horse. Their innocent, happy sounds were filling the air, and this thing was listening to them, watching them. That's when the paralysis broke. Something snapped inside me. Motherly instinct, maybe? Adrenaline? I don't know. But suddenly I could move, and all I could think about was getting my kids away from that thing. My voice came out a hoarse whisper, but I yelled as loud as I could, "Sarah, Mikey, Emily, now, come here now!" My voice must have sounded different because they all stopped instantly. Sarah jumped off the swing, Mikey scrambled to his feet at the bottom of the slide, and even little Emily turned around, clutching her plastic horse. They looked at me, their faces confused, then they followed my gaze towards the woods, and they saw it. I saw their faces change. The confusion melted away, replaced by... Sarah's eyes went wide. Mikey's mouth dropped open. Emily just stared, her thumb going into her mouth. They saw it. They saw the creature at the edge of the woods watching them. Sarah was the first to speak, her voice trembling. "Mommy, what is that?" Mikey just pointed, speechless. And Emily, in her innocent little voice, she said, "Mommy, is that Bigfoot?" Bigfoot. The word hung in the air, ridiculous and terrifying at the same time. I don't know why, but in that moment, hearing Emily say, "Bigfoot," it just confirmed something in my mind. This wasn't a deer, it wasn't a bear, it wasn't a person. It was something else. I didn't have time to process it. I just reacted. I nodded, barely a whisper. "Yes, honey, that's Bigfoot." Lie or not, it was the only thing I could think of to make sense of it to them, and honestly to myself too in that moment. Some primal part of me recognized it, even if my logical brain was screaming that it couldn't be real. I grabbed Emily's hand and pulled her close. "Okay, kids," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, even though my heart was hammering against my ribs. "We're going to go now. We're just going to walk slowly, and we're going to go to Grandma's house, okay?" Grandma lived just a couple of streets over, closer than our house. I told Sarah, "Sarah, you hold Mikey's hand, and we're going to walk backwards. Keep watching Bigfoot. Don't take your eyes off of him." I don't know why I said that. Some instinct told me we couldn't turn our backs on it. We had to keep it in sight. So we started to back away, slowly, painfully slowly. My legs felt like lead. Every muscle in my body was tense, screaming to run, but I forced myself to move deliberately, cautiously. The kids were silent now, their faces pale, their eyes fixed on the woods. Sarah was holding Mikey's hand so tight I thought she might break his fingers. Emily was whimpering softly, clutching my leg. We kept backing away, step by agonizing step. The creature in the woods, it just stayed there. It didn't move, it didn't come closer, it just watched. Those dark eyes, they were fixed on us, following our every move. It felt like they were boring right into my soul. We were maybe halfway across the park, backing towards the street, when I dared to glance back at the woods again. And it was gone. Just like that. 1 second it was there, a dark shape in the trees. The next second, nothing. Just trees and shadows. I stopped backing away. I stared at the woods, trying to see if it was still there, if it had just moved deeper into the trees. But there was nothing. No sound, no movement, nothing but the rustle of leaves in the breeze. It had vanished. "Mommy," Sarah whispered, her voice shaky. "Is it gone?" I scanned the trees again, desperately searching for any sign of it. Nothing. I think so," I said, my voice still trembling. "I think it's gone." But even as I said it, I wasn't sure. I didn't feel safe. I still felt that cold knot of terror in my stomach, like it could reappear at any moment. We didn't wait around to find out. I grabbed Sarah and Mikey's hands, scooped Emily up in my arms, and we ran. We ran out of the park, across the street, down the sidewalk, all the way to Grandma's house. We didn't stop running until we were inside her front door, breathless and shaking. We stayed at Grandma's house for hours that day. I called my husband Michael at work, and he rushed over, his face white when I told him what had happened. We told Grandma some vague story about seeing a big animal in the woods, not wanting to scare her too much, but the kids, they knew. They were quiet and clingy all afternoon, their usual energy completely drained. We went home late that evening, long after dark. Michael checked the park, of course. He walked around the edges of the woods, even ventured in a little way. He found nothing. No tracks, no broken branches, no sign that anything unusual had been there at all. He tried to be reassuring, telling me it was probably just a bear, or maybe someone playing a prank, dressing up in a costume. But I knew. Deep down, I knew what I had seen wasn't a bear, and it wasn't a person in a costume. We moved out of Willow Creek a few months later. It wasn't just because of that incident. Other reasons too. But honestly, that day in the park, it changed everything. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of being unsafe. Even in our own house, I'd find myself looking out the windows, scanning the trees at the edge of our yard, just waiting for something. We live in a different state now, far away from Willow Creek. But sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet, I still think about it, about those dark eyes watching us from the woods, about the way it just stood there, silent and still, about the feeling of pure primal fear. I still can't explain it. Was it really Bigfoot? I don't know. I used to think Bigfoot was just a myth, a story people told. Now, I'm not so sure. Something was out there in those woods, something big, something dark, something watching. And I saw it, and it saw me, and it saw my kids. And that's something I'll never forget. And honestly, I still don't understand what it wanted or why it was just there. It just stood there watching, and then it was gone. Just like that, gone. And I still can't make sense of it. It's like it just stopped. Story 13. It was cold, like bone-chilling January cold that sinks right into you, no matter how many layers you're wearing. I was out at Dad's farm, like I always am after work most weekdays, taking care of my daughter's horses. It's a routine, you know, something I do to unwind, clear my head after dealing with the office crap all day. Plus, I enjoy being around the animals. It's peaceful usually. This Tuesday, though, something was off the moment I pulled into the drive. It was getting dark already, the sun sinking behind the bare trees, casting long, creepy shadows across the snow-covered fields. The air was heavy, still, like it was holding its breath. I parked by the house, grabbed the feed buckets from the back of the truck, and headed toward the barn. Usually, the horses, Bonnie and Clyde, they'd be right at the gate, nickering and stomping, practically begging for their dinner. They know the routine as well as I do. But tonight, nothing. Just silence, and darkness creeping into every corner. I figured maybe they were just deeper in the pasture, huddling together against the cold. Except when I got closer to the barn, I could see them. They were out there, near the fence line, but they weren't moving. They were just standing, still as statues, heads up, ears twitching, staring at the barn, staring at it like they'd seen a ghost. That already set my teeth on edge. Bonnie and Clyde, they're usually like Labrador puppies in horse form, always curious, always wanting attention. To see them acting like that, skittish and frozen, that was weird. Then I noticed the barn cats. We have a few that hang around, mostly wild, but they're smart, know where the food is. They're always slinking around the barn, hunting mice or hoping for a handout. Not tonight. Nowhere to be seen. It was dead silent, eerily silent. No horses whinnying, no cats meowing, not even the usual creak of the old barn in the wind. Just nothing. A wave of unease washed over me. That feeling you get in the pit of your stomach when something is just not right. I hesitated for a second outside the barn door, looking at Bonnie and Clyde. They were still fixed on the barn, eyes wide, nostrils flared. They were spooked, really spooked. And whatever had spooked them, I was about to walk right into. I told myself to stop being an idiot. It's just a barn. It's cold. Animals are acting weird in the cold. End of story. But that feeling, it just wouldn't shake off. I've lived on farms my whole life. You get a sense for these things. Something was off, seriously off. I pushed the heavy wooden door open, the hinges groaning in protest, the sound echoing way too loudly in the stillness. The barn was even darker inside than I expected. The single bare bulb hanging from the rafters cast long, distorted shadows, making everything look unfamiliar and menacing. The smell of hay and horse manure, usually comforting and familiar, felt different tonight, almost tainted somehow. I flipped the light switch inside the door. Nothing. Great. Bulb must have finally burned out. Just what I needed. I fumbled for my phone in my pocket, used the flashlight app to get some light. The beam cut through the darkness, just enough to see the feed bins, the hay bales stacked against the walls, the empty stalls. Normal barn stuff, but the silence was still oppressive. And the feeling of being watched, that was growing stronger every second. I started to walk further into the barn, aiming for the feed bins at the back. My boots crunched on the dirt floor, each step sounding too loud, too deliberate. And then I heard it. Thump. Just one sound. Muffled, heavy, like something solid and heavy had just dropped onto a wooden floor. It came from above me, from the hayloft. My blood ran cold, instantaneously, like someone had thrown a bucket of ice water down my back. Every hair on my arm stood straight up. My heart hammered against my ribs, so loud I could hear it in my ears over the ringing silence. I stopped dead in my tracks, phone flashlight beam wavering in my trembling hand, pointed upwards now, at the loft floor above me, the hayloft. It's just storage space, mostly. Loose hay, some old tools Dad hasn't gotten around to throwing out, ratty old blankets. Nothing up there that should be making noise, nothing that should be moving. Except, it just did. That thump. That wasn't wind. That wasn't anything normal. Then I heard it again. Creak, creak, groan. The floorboards above me. Old weathered boards nailed to the rafters decades ago, and they were creaking. They were groaning under weight. Heavy weight. Something was up there. Something big and heavy was moving around in the hayloft. And I was alone in the barn, in the dark, with it. My breath hitched in my throat. I tried to swallow, but my mouth was suddenly bone dry. Panic started to claw its way up my chest, tightening, suffocating. My mind raced, trying to find a rational explanation. Raccoons, possums, maybe. But raccoons and possums don't make thumping sounds. And they definitely don't weigh enough to make those floorboards groan like that. And the horses, Bonnie and Clyde out there, terrified, staring at this barn. They knew. Animals always know. Another sound from above. A scraping noise now, like something dragging across the wooden floor, closer this time, right above me. Dust motes drifted down from the gaps between the floorboards in the flashlight beam, dancing in the air. Small bits of hay, dislodged from whatever was moving up there, floated down like snowflakes. My legs felt like lead, frozen to the spot. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, just stared upwards at those groaning floorboards, waiting. Waiting for... what? My mind flashed back. Years ago, we'd taken the kids to this park, a nature preserve out of town. Beautiful place, trails winding through the woods. We were hiking, enjoying the afternoon, when suddenly, out of nowhere, this creature stepped out of the trees onto the path right in front of us. I don't even know what it was. Tall, gaunt, pale, with these long, spindly limbs. Its eyes, they were black, empty, like holes punched in a sheet. It just stood there staring at us, a cold, predatory stare that went right through you. It didn't make a sound, didn't move, just watched. We froze, couldn't speak, couldn't move. My daughter started to cry, silent tears streaming down her face. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it turned, melted back into the trees, and was gone. We ran all the way back to the car, didn't stop until we were miles away. We never spoke about it, never told anyone what we saw. We tried to pretend it didn't happen, tried to bury it. But it's always been there, in the back of my mind, a cold, dark shadow. And now it felt like that shadow had just stepped out of the trees again, into this barn, above me. Terror, raw and primal, surged through me. This wasn't raccoons, this wasn't possums, this was something else, something dark, something dangerous, something other. My eyes darted around, desperately searching for anything I could use, anything to defend myself against... what? I didn't even know, but my instincts screamed at me, "Get out now!" Except I couldn't just leave, not like this, not knowing what was up there. What if it came down? What if it followed me, out into the open? My gaze fell on the hay forks. We keep a couple leaning against the wall for moving hay bales, long, heavy wooden handles with sharp metal tines. Not much, but better than nothing. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the handle, but I grabbed one hay fork, then another, one in each hand, pointing upwards towards the loft. My heart pounded, each beat a deafening drum in my ears. I took a deep breath, tried to steady my shaking hands. I wasn't going to just stand here and wait. If whatever was up there wanted to come down, it was going to have to come through me. I took a tentative step forward, towards the loft ladder, phone flashlight beam still pointing upwards, scanning the floorboards above. I needed to see, needed to know what I was facing. I tried to peek through the gaps between the boards, straining my eyes in the dim light, praying that my gaze wouldn't meet whatever was up there, praying that I wouldn't see what my mind was imagining. But it was too dark, couldn't see anything clearly, just shadows, dust, and those damn creaking floorboards. And then another movement, but different this time. Shifting, sliding, like something was moving sideways across the loft floor, away from me. The weight above me shifted, moved away from directly overhead, further into the loft, towards the far side of the barn, away from the ladder, away from me. A wave of desperate hope washed over me. Maybe it was leaving, maybe whatever it was going away, giving me a chance. This was my chance, my only chance. I didn't hesitate. I dropped the hay forks with a clatter, spun around and ran towards the small side door of the barn, the one we use for quick exits. Ran like hell, Didn't look back, didn't think, just ran. The wooden door rattled as I slammed it open, bursting out into the frigid night air. Gasping, I stumbled out of the barn, into the darkness. My chest heaved, lungs burning, legs pumping, adrenaline surging. I didn't stop running until I reached the fence, Bonnie and Clyde still standing there, still frozen, still staring at the barn. I kept running, past them, towards the open pasture gate, towards the safety of the house, lights blazing in the windows. Once I was outside the pasture, I stopped finally, leaned against the fence, chest still heaving, catching my breath. Staring back at the barn, dark, silent, ominous. The barn door I'd run through was still wide open, gaping like a black maw in the darkness. I stood there for a long time just watching it, waiting for something to come out, for the door to creak open further, for a shadow to appear in the doorway. Nothing, just silence and the cold, biting wind. Eventually, I managed to walk, slowly, shakily, back to the barn. I reached out, trembling hand closing on the door, and pulled it shut with a loud, echoing bang that broke the silence again, snapped the latch closed, locked it. As if a simple wooden latch could keep whatever was in there, in there. I backed away from the barn, slowly, still staring at it, until I reached the house. I went inside, heart still hammering, cold sweat chilling my skin. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even inside the house with the lights on, surrounded by the familiar comfort of the kitchen. Later that evening, my daughter and her husband, Mark, came by. They were going out to dinner, stopped to check on us. "Hey, Dad, you left the barn door open," my daughter said, frowning slightly as she came in. "Did you forget to close it after feeding the horses?" "No," I said, voice still a little shaky. "No, I closed it. I'm sure I closed it." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Well, it was wide open when we drove up. Bonnie and Clyde were acting all weird too, restless. I just looked at them, at my daughter's concerned face, Mark's questioning gaze. I didn't want to tell them, didn't want to sound crazy, but I had to. I took a deep breath, and the words just came spilling out. I told them everything, about the silence, the horses, the cats gone, the sound from the loft, the feeling of being watched, the thing in the park years ago. Everything. They listened, quietly, patiently. My daughter's face grew pale as I talked. Mark listened with that serious, thoughtful expression he gets when he's trying to figure something out. When I finished, the kitchen was silent, just the low hum of the refrigerator. Finally, my daughter spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Dad, that's really creepy." Then she said something that made the blood run cold all over again. "You know, I've been hearing things too, behind the barn, for the past few weeks actually. I didn't say anything because I thought it was just animals, you know, foxes maybe, but grunting sounds, like something heavy moving around in the woods behind the barn at night, deep growling grunts." She looked at me, her eyes wide and scared. "Dad, do you think that's what you heard in the loft?" I didn't say anything. I couldn't, because in that moment, standing in my warm kitchen surrounded by my family, I knew with a chilling certainty that whatever I had heard in the barn, whatever had been moving in the hayloft above me, it wasn't just animals, and I still don't know what it was. I don't know what it wanted. I just know I was lucky to get out of that barn that night, and every time I have to go out there now, even in broad daylight, even with the sun shining, I can't shake the feeling that it's still watching, waiting in the shadows of the old barn. Story 14. The minute I got close to the hutch, I knew something was off. Chester was usually right at the front, practically begging for his pellets, nosing at the wire mesh and wiggling his nose like crazy. But tonight, he was shoved way back in the corner of his little wooden house, practically vibrating. He was trembling so hard. Wouldn't even come out when I opened the hutch and rattled the bag. That's never happened, never. I got a weird feeling then, a prickle on the back of my neck. It wasn't just that Chester was acting strange, it was the whole air, thick and heavy like before a storm. But there weren't any clouds, just stars, so many you could lose yourself staring at them. But tonight, I didn't want to look up. I just wanted to get Chester fed and get back inside. I poured the food in his bowl, talking to him softly, trying to coax him out. "Hey, buddy, it's just me, Norman. You hungry? Come on, good food here." He twitched his nose a little, but stayed put, eyes wide and dark in the dim light. Even after I'd filled his bowl and stepped back, he didn't move. He was scared, really scared. And that started to make me scared too. Animals can sense things we can't, right? That thought went right through me, cold and sharp. I shut the hutch door, latched it tight, tighter than usual for some reason. As I turned to head back to the house, that's when I heard it. Footsteps. Just soft, like brushing through leaves, but distinct. Not crunching like you make on gravel, more like deliberate steps, but muffled. My first thought, like anyone out here in Guernsey Hollow, was deer. Deer are everywhere, and they're always wandering around, especially at night. They're quiet on their feet, but they're usually pretty noisy when they're moving through the brush. This was different. This was too rhythmic, too even. I stopped dead. Silence, except for the crickets and whatever else bugs make noise at night, and my own heart starting to thump harder in my chest. And then, the footsteps stopped too, right when I did. That's not a deer. A deer would keep moving, or bolt if it was spooked. It wouldn't just stop when I stopped. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, the quiet playing tricks on my ears, Chester spooking me. But I knew it wasn't. That feeling in the back of my neck was getting stronger, like someone was watching me, right from the edge of the woods that ran alongside the driveway. I started walking again, a little faster now, just wanting to get back to the trailer. The driveway is gravel, loose and noisy under your feet. My boots crunched, loud in the stillness. And then I heard it again, the soft, muffled steps, keeping pace with me, but in the woods to my left, just off the driveway. They sped up a little as I sped up, still keeping the same distance. Not random, not like an animal just wandering. This was following. My breath started to get short. My hands felt clammy, even though it was a cool night. I kept my eyes straight ahead, not wanting to look over into the dark trees. "Just walk faster," I told myself. "Get to the trailer, get inside, turn on the lights, and it'll all be okay. It's just nerves, it's just the dark." But with every step the feeling got worse. It felt heavy, like something pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears now, drowning out the crickets, almost drowning out the soft footfalls from the woods. I reached the spot where the trees thin out a little, where you can see past them into the darker part of the woods, down the slope towards the creek. There's a break in the trees there where it opens up a bit, and the undergrowth gets sparser. I stopped again, couldn't help myself. I had to know. I had to see. Holding my breath, I turned my head slowly to the left and peered into the shadows. It was so dark under the trees, like black ink spilled everywhere. For a second, I didn't see anything, just the solid wall of darkness and the faint shimmer of starlight filtering through the leaves. Then I saw it. Movement. A darker patch of dark, shifting in the shadows, about 30 feet in, maybe a little more. At first it was just a shape, indistinct, blending in with the trees and shadows. But as I strained my eyes, trying to make sense of it, it started to take form. It was tall, taller than any person, that's for sure. And it was upright, standing on two legs, not bent over like a deer or a bear on all fours. This was standing straight like a man. But it wasn't a man, not even close. Panic slammed into me like a punch to the gut. All the air rushed out of my lungs and my heart went into overdrive. My legs felt weak, like they wanted to buckle under me. This wasn't a deer. This wasn't anything I knew. My mind scrambled, trying to find something, anything, to make sense of what I was seeing, but there was nothing, just pure, raw fear. The shape moved again, shifting slightly, and I saw it more clearly. It was dark, so dark it seemed to suck the light out of the air around it, and it was hairy, covered in something thick and dark like fur, but longer, coarser looking. It was too far away to see details clearly in the darkness, but the shape, the sheer size of it, the way it moved, it wasn't human, and it wasn't any animal I'd ever seen or even imagined. I didn't wait to see any more. I didn't think. My legs just took over and I ran. Not just fast walking anymore, I was full out sprinting, pounding down the gravel driveway, my boots slipping and sliding, loose stones spraying out behind me. Every breath was a raw gasp in my throat, burning like fire, but I didn't stop. Couldn't stop. I could feel it behind me, even though I couldn't hear the footsteps anymore over the pounding of my own heart and the rush of blood in my ears. But I knew it was there. I could feel it like a weight pressing down on my back, pushing me forward, driving me to run faster, harder. The trailer finally came into sight, thank God. My father-in-law's trailer parked right next to ours. His porch light was off, but he's usually asleep by now anyway. The porch was just a small wooden platform with a couple of steps up. I stumbled onto the bottom step, almost tripping, scrabbling for the handrail, hauling myself up onto the porch. My hand was shaking so bad I could barely get it around the doorknob. Fumbling, got my fingers around it, turned, pushed, stumbled inside. Safe, almost safe. But then, as I reached for the door handle to slam it shut, it happened. The motion sensor light. My father-in-law has these two big floodlights mounted on the corner of his trailer, aimed down the driveway, triggered by movement. And as I was right there at the door, reaching to go inside, something else must have moved too. The lights snapped on, blinding, white-hot light cutting through the darkness, flooding the whole yard. And in that split second, that fraction of a heartbeat, I saw it. It wasn't behind me anymore. It was ahead of me, right there, in the full glare of the floodlights, just beyond the parked truck that sits between the trailers. It had moved impossibly fast, somehow gotten around me, or through the trees, I don't know how. But it was there. And it wasn't just a shape in the dark anymore. This was real. Bathed in light, every detail sharp and horrifying. It was huge. Taller than the trailer, I swear to God, towering over the hood of the pickup truck parked there. At least 7, maybe 8 feet tall, maybe more. Upright, like a man, but nothing human about it. Covered head to toe in thick, matted fur, black as night except for the way the floodlights caught the ends, making them gleam greasy and dark brown. Its arms were long, hanging down past its knees, thick and muscled, ending in hands, or paws, I don't know what they were, but they were big, with long, dark claws. Its legs were thick too, powerful looking, with those same claws at the end of its feet. It had a head, perched on top of that massive body, and even in that split second I saw enough. It was long and pointed like a dog's snout, but flatter, broader. And the eyes, oh God, the eyes. They weren't reflecting the light like animal eyes do, shiny and bright. They were just dark holes, black pits that seemed to suck in the light, but at the same time they glowed from inside with a dull, red something. Anger, hunger, pure evil. I don't know. But they were the worst part. They looked right through you, like you were nothing. And then it roared, not like a lion, not like a bear, not like anything I've ever heard. It was a guttural shriek, a raw, tearing sound that ripped through the night, vibrating in my chest, making my teeth ache. It wasn't just loud, it was terrifying. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated rage and something else, something ancient and hungry. My blood turned to ice. Every hair on my body stood on end. The smell hit me then too. A stench, thick and overpowering like wet dog, but 100 times worse. Rancid, musky, something dead and decaying underneath, mixed with something animal, wild. It was so strong it burned my nostrils, made my eyes water. It didn't run, it didn't attack, it just moved. It stepped around the pickup truck, its huge body brushing against the side of the cab, and it was gone. Into the shadows on the other side of the yard, back into the woods, disappearing into the darkness like it was swallowed up. It moved fast, incredibly fast, not running, but striding, each step covering impossible ground. 1 second it was there, a monster in the floodlights, and the next, gone. Just gone. The floodlights stayed on, blazing into the empty yard. The crickets started up again, chirping like nothing had happened. But the air was still thick with that stench, and the roar still echoed in my ears. My legs finally gave out, and I just slumped against the trailer door, my heart hammering, lungs burning, shaking so hard I thought I was going to fall apart. I stayed there for what felt like forever, just staring out into the empty darkness, listening for any sound, any movement. Nothing, just silence, broken only by the crickets and my own ragged breathing. Finally, I managed to push myself up, stumbled inside, slammed and locked the trailer door, bolted it too, even though I knew it wouldn't stop. That thing. Nothing would stop that thing if it wanted to get in. I didn't sleep that night. Sat up in the living room, every light in the trailer blazing, staring out the windows, jumpy at every creak and shadow, listening for footsteps, for that roar, for that smell. Nothing came back, but the image of it burned into my eyes, the sound of its cry, the stench. They stayed. They're still here. It's been weeks now. I still feed Chester, but I go out earlier before it gets dark, and I carry a flashlight, a big one, and something else. Something to protect myself, even though I don't know if anything can protect you from that. I haven't seen it again, haven't heard it, haven't smelled it. But every night, when the dark comes down over Guernsey Hollow and the quiet settles in, I think about it. I see those red eyes in my head, hear that scream, smell that awful stink, and I know it's still out there, somewhere in the woods, watching, waiting. I don't know what it was. I don't know what it wanted. I just know I saw it. I know what I saw, and I'll never forget it. Never. And sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet, I think I hear those soft footsteps again, just at the edge of hearing, out in the dark. And the fear comes back cold and real, and I know it could come back. It could come back any time. And I'll be out there in the dark, in Guernsey Hollow, and there will be nothing I can do. Story 15. It was a Tuesday, late November, that kind of biting cold where the air feels sharp in your lungs. I was driving back home to Uniontown from Connellsville, taking Broadhead Road like I always do. It's quicker than 119 if you know the back roads, even though it's a bit winding and rough in places. Honestly, most of the roads around here are like that, Pennsylvania hills and all, you know. Anyway, it was already properly dark out, maybe around 7:30 or 8. I was thinking about dinner, figuring on making some spaghetti when I got in. Nothing fancy, just something warm and easy after work. My Jeep Liberty, old girl, she's reliable as hell, but the roads around Broadhead, especially that stretch after you pass the old Miller farm, can be a little uneven. You got to pay attention, even if you've driven it 1,000,000 times. There's this one hill, not crazy steep, but enough that your headlights dip for a second as you start to climb. That's exactly what happened. Headlights dipped. Road got a little darker for a split second, like it always does when you crest that small rise. Except this time, it wasn't just the road dipping. It was like someone had thrown a switch. Complete darkness. Not the kind where your headlights just aren't reaching far enough. No, this was total, absolute black. Like someone had just snuffed out the lights, not just for me, but for the whole world right in front of my car. It was instant. Then, just as suddenly, boom, headlights back, normal as anything. It was maybe a second, 2 seconds tops that everything was black, but in that second, I felt this jolt of wrongness. My first thought was the Jeep. Electrical system hiccup, something like that. These older models, they can get quirky, but then I thought, both headlights at once? That's weirdly precise for a short. I was starting to get that little prickle of unease. You know, the hairs on your arms just starting to stand up without you even realizing it. I slowed down a little, just instinctively. Maybe I should pull over, check the lights, make sure everything was okay. That's when I saw it. To my left, just off the edge of the road, where the woods start to get thick. It wasn't far, maybe 10, 15 feet from the shoulder of the road. It was just there. And the first thing that hit me, before I even really registered what it was the shadow. It was casting this impossibly deep shadow, darker than the woods behind it, darker than the night itself, and yet the headlights were full beam, pointing right at it. It didn't make sense, and then I saw the shape, tall, unbelievably tall, taller than anything natural I've ever seen, taller than any tree out there, and there are some old giants in those woods. It was standing upright, completely still, just a dark silhouette against the darker trees. But not like a silhouette you'd see of a person or a deer. It was wrong. All wrong. My mind was screaming, trying to fit it into something recognizable. Was it a bear standing on its hind legs? No, too tall, too thin, wrong shape entirely. A person? No way. No person is that tall. And who would be standing out in the freezing woods, in the pitch black, completely motionless, right next to Broadhead Road? It wasn't making any sense, and the lack of sense, that's what started to twist my stomach into knots. I remember just staring, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. I think I might have even stopped breathing for a second. My brain just locked up, trying to process what I was seeing, but coming up empty, like trying to force a key into the wrong lock. It just wouldn't fit. It was dark, just black. No real detail to it, not in terms of color, just this overwhelming sense of blackness, like it was absorbing the light, pulling it in. But the outline was what truly messed with me. It was too angular in places where it shouldn't be, too straight, too elongated, and thin, unnaturally thin, like it was stretched out, pulled too long, and yet somehow thick at the same time. It's hard to explain. It defied dimensions. Then it moved, just slightly, and that's when the real bone-deep fear hit me. It wasn't running or jumping or doing anything dramatic. It just shifted its weight a little, and turned its head, maybe? I couldn't really make out a head exactly, not a proper head, but the top part of the shape seemed to turn in my direction, slowly, deliberately, and it was facing me. I could feel it. Even though it was just a dark shape and I couldn't see features, I knew, with a certainty that went right down to my marrow, that it was looking directly at me. And there was intent. I don't know how else to describe it. Not malice, not exactly anger, but something watchful, something interested. Like I was a bug under a microscope and it was finally taking a good look. Panic flooded me. Real, raw, animal panic. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to get away. My foot slammed down on the gas pedal before I even consciously decided to. The Jeep lurched forward, tires spitting gravel. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep them on the wheel. I was fumbling for the door lock, trying to find that damn button in the dark, my heart hammering against my ribs like it was trying to break free. I found the lock button. Stabbed at it again and again, heard the click as all the doors locked. Stupid, I know, like that flimsy lock on a Jeep door was going to stop whatever that was if it wanted in. But it was something, anything to feel a tiny sliver safer, a pathetic illusion of protection in the face of, I still don't know what. As I was flooring it, my eyes darted back to the left, just for a split second, against every survival instinct screaming at me not to. And that's when I saw it again. It had moved. It was closer to the road now, maybe only 5 or 6 feet from the edge, right by this big old oak tree that hangs over the shoulder there. And it had one of its appendages on the tree. That image. That's the one that's burned into my brain, that wakes me up sweating in the middle of the night even now. It wasn't a hand, not like any hand I've ever seen. But that's the closest word I can use. It was long, impossibly long and thin, but not just thin like a finger, thin like wire almost, but thicker and dark, blacker than black, if that's even possible. And it had digits, long, spindly things, not fingers, but digits. 3, maybe 4, I couldn't be sure, too quick, too dark. But they were curled around the bark of the oak tree, not gripping it, not holding on, but resting, like it was just leaning on the tree, casually, like someone leaning on a fence post to watch the traffic go by. Except this wasn't someone, and I wasn't traffic. And the way it was touching the tree, it wasn't normal. It felt intimate, wrongly intimate, like it was connecting with the tree in some way, drawing something from it, or maybe communicating with it. It's insane, I know, it sounds completely nuts even to me now, but that's the feeling I got. And it was watching me, still watching me. Even as I sped away, it was there, that black shape, that impossible hand resting on the tree, and it was just observing. Then, as quick as it had appeared, it was gone, vanished. One blink, and the space next to the oak was empty. Just trees and shadows and the normal darkness of the woods, like it had never been there at all. I kept driving, fast, way too fast for Broadhead Road, especially at night, with all the twists and turns and potholes. But I didn't care. I just needed to get home, needed to get away from that place, from that thing, from that feeling. I didn't slow down until I hit Route 119, back in proper civilization, with streetlights and other cars. Even then, I kept looking in my rearview mirror constantly, convinced I'd see it back there, looming up behind me, impossibly fast, impossibly there. I got home, pulled into my driveway, slammed the Jeep into park and practically jumped out, ran to the front door, fumbled with my keys, got inside, slammed and locked the door behind me. Then I just stood there in the hallway, panting, my heart still pounding like a drum solo. The lights were on in the house, normal, warm, safe, the smell of old wood and dust and home. My dog Buster started barking from the living room, confused by my sudden frantic entrance. He came trotting out, tail wagging, and jumped up on me, licking my hand. Just a normal dog, in a normal house. Everything was normal, except nothing felt normal. The cold, sharp fear was still gripping me, a vice around my chest. My skin felt cold and clammy, even though the house was warm. My legs were shaking. I made spaghetti that night, just like I planned. Boiled the water, browned the ground beef, stirred in the sauce. Moved like a robot, going through the motions, but not really there. Couldn't taste the food, couldn't focus on anything but that thing. I didn't sleep well that night. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside the window made me jump. I kept seeing that dark shape, that impossible hand, those watching eyes, whatever they were. I haven't driven Broadhead Road at night since. I take 119 now, even though it's longer, even though it's out of my way. It's stupid, I know, irrational, but I can't make myself go back there after dark. Not after seeing that. People tell me it was probably just a shadow, trick of the light, my imagination running wild because I was tired and it was dark. They say there are black bears around here. Maybe I saw a bear, or a deer, silhouetted against the trees. They try to give me normal explanations, things that fit into the world as they know it. But I know what I saw. I felt it, the absolute, undeniable wrongness of it. The way it moved, the way it watched, the hand. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't anything I can explain. It was something else. Something that shouldn't be here. Something that didn't belong. And to this day, whenever I drive past that stretch of Broadhead Road, even in broad daylight, I get a chill down my spine. I still look to the left, to that spot by the oak tree, and I still feel that little flicker of something. Fear, curiosity, terror. I don't know what to call it anymore. All I know is I saw something that night that I can't explain, something that still haunts me, something that made me question everything I thought I knew about what's real and what's not. And sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the wind is howling outside, I wonder if it's still out there, in the darkness, watching, waiting, by the side of Broadhead Road. And that thought terrifies me more than anything.